Hello, everyone, and welcome to another but slightly strange episode of Let's Complete Enderal Forgotten Stories. There's going to be a story that we're going to be reading right now, and it won't be forgotten. It'll be very much unforgotten stories, perhaps. I don't know. Basically, first of all, I have no idea how long this video is going to be. I think it's probably going to be like over 3 hours, which is going to be crazy. But basically, we have this Butcher of Ark series to read, and it is important to both the faction and also it's a quest in its own right. And so I feel like I need to read them, and so that they're in the videos, so that it's like it's a 100% series. Like I want you guys to see everything as I'm seeing it as well. But they are just too long to read in like a proper video. So this is gonna be a separate episode. We've already read volume 1 in episode 64, so this should be episode 65.5. I'm gonna do like a half episode and it'll just be a bonus one. So if you're not interested in hearing the saga of the Butcher of Ark, just skip this video, because all we're gonna be doing is I'm gonna be sitting here and I'm gonna be reading all of these books. And volume 1 took us 22 minutes to read. And we have 9 other volumes to read. So I would buckle up. I used the console to add volume 10 into my inventory just for the sake of this video. I will, of course, I'm going to reload the save, so it will never have happened. There was also like some quest stuff that happened. We will reload the save. This will have technically never have happened, but for the sake of the let's play, we're going to read these. So why don't we, and I'm in the library, by the way, in Ark, because where else would we sit and read these? I mean, this is pretty much the perfect place. Let's sit down and find somewhere cozy. Where's nice to read? Maybe at the back here somewhere? Yeah, I like to sit alone, so sit at the back, we'll have a nice sit down, and we will read our book series. So, we've read Follow the Fire, and now we have volume 2, The Nameless One. So, let's get into this. Chapter 2, The Nameless One. Up to the present day, the origin and nature of this vision has remained a mystery to me. Who was the enigmatic woman? How had she entered my thoughts? Or was it not her, but merely a spectral image conjured by my inner workings, an embodiment of my subconscious? These were the questions that went through my head after I awakened. Yet I had not much time to ponder, for when I awoke, breathing heavily and soaked in sweat, I realized that something was different. Disoriented, I pushed myself up and rubbed my aching eyes. I looked around the room, my bones cracking reluctantly as I turned my head left and right. Nothing. My surroundings seemed perfectly normal. Again, I let my gaze roam the narrow room from the heavy wooden door over the small wardrobe to the scribe's desk in the right corner, on which numerous tomes and scrolls lay in disorder. Uncertainly, I closed my eyes and focused inward into myself. No, the repugnancy was not to be found in my surroundings. It stemmed from me. To be precise, it originated from a strange feeling in my stomach that was unknown to me back then. It was an uneasiness, dull and stagnant, a diffuse fear similar to the one we experience when we know terrible or challenging things await us. Nevertheless, the feeling seemed familiar, a sort of gloomy truth which had been suppressed in my subconscious all these years, and had now found its way to the surface like glowing coal beneath a thin layer of fissured ice beginning to melt. Bewildered, I laid my hands on my stomach in an almost childlike manner. Of course, it did not help. The strange, dull feeling remained. I rose dizzily and looked out at the narrow window above the scribe's desk. The vision had felt like an eternity, yet seemed to have lasted no more than an hour in reality. Still, not a single sound from outside reached my ear, and the light was dim and pale. Only a pallid grey cone of sunlight brightened the dance of 100 confused grains of dust in the air. In addition to my inexplicable sense of uneasiness, I was nauseated, my eyes burned, and I felt weak. Water. I need water. I moved to the trough, which was filled with fresh spring water next to the heavy wooden door. My uneasiness grew stronger, and an absurd fear took hold of me. What would I see in the mirror of water when I bent over the trough? The deformed and decayed grimace I had seen in the ruin? Or the unremarkable face of a man who lived his life ruled by coincidence and lack of alternatives instead of free will? I fought the urge to back away from the trough and made myself get on my knees in front of it instead. My fear was baseless. No festering maggots crawled from my face that stared at me in the reflection. No chapped skin revealing the flesh on the bones beneath. Just a dream. It was just a dream. I smiled weakly and confused at my own folly, cupped my hands to scoop some water and drank in deep gulps. Then I sprinkled some water on my face and rubbed it on my body, my hair, my arms, and my feet. I took the brush of boar bristles and scrubbed my skin until it started to bite. Finally, I took my brown priest's robe from the cast iron hook by the door, slipped it over my head, and leaned against the wall. I felt better, but not well. It was just a dream. I repeated the sentence several times in my thoughts in an attempt to banish the remnants of what I believed to be a nightmare. Yet the desired effect did not occur, for every time I closed my eyes, visions of my own corpse flooded me and my uneasiness grew, as if it wanted to emphasize the dream's meaning. I sighed and did what I always did when I contemplated. I began to pace around my room. I remember all too well that this was the first time in my life that silence appeared oppressive to me. How I wished to hear the familiar creaking of cartwheels, the bright calls of the baker, or the bray of a donkey. But there was nothing, absolutely nothing to hear, not even the mournful singing of the wind, which was usually omnipresent in Fogville. With the pale light in my chamber, I felt like part of a termitrillion mourning tableau. Over and over, the same images flashed through my mind. The coffin, the corpse, the veiled woman and her words. Follow the fire. End your false life. Was there a connection between these words and the dull feeling in my stomach? Why did I dream of such things at all? What by the righteous path did it mean? My countenance clouded. False life? What a heap of nonsense. I lived exactly the life the path had chosen for me, even if, from time to time, gloomy thoughts occupied my mind, and I felt envious of the adventurers who took a rest in Fogville before continuing their journeys. It did not mean that my pious life was in any way false. No, I was lucky that I did not have to live by the side of my miserable father, smearing grease on animal hides. I was even luckier not to be one of the ill-fated people who cut each other's throats for a stale piece of bread in the undercity of Ark. I pinched the bridge of my nose, squeezing my eyes shut. These are the very thoughts that make path-abiding people stray from the path. They become attracted to an insane vision of an adventurous life, and get drawn into suffering and misery. I recalled the terrible stories which occasionally reached Fogville. It was always the egoists and those who hungered for power who dragged innocent people into ruin along with them. I dropped my hand and opened my eyes. No, my life is exactly as it should be. Is that so, JL? I startled. What in blazes? Irritated, I moved around trying to find the voice's origin. Nothing. I was alone. But then where had this voice come from? I must have imagined it. It had come to that. I was hearing voices. This dream is driving me insane. Angry with myself, I started pacing again. But only after 2 steps, the voice resounded again in my head, and along with it, the dull feeling in my stomach burned like a blazing fire in the wind. Images and feelings rose in my consciousness, heavy and pressing, but familiar at the same time. This time the voice spoke with a mixture of mourning and mockery. How much longer do you want to close your eyes to the truth? What needs to happen to make you finally understand? I tumbled backwards, not so much because of the words, but due to the sensation they triggered. Thoughts fluttered through my mind like a flock of startled birds, and they did not only revolve around the scenes from my dream anymore. I saw myself lying on my bed, drenched with sweat, shivering. I saw myself gloomily staring off in the distance while Mater Pylea read out the path to me. With these thoughts came a crawling uneasiness, a sense of loneliness and fear. Instinctively, I pressed both hands against my stomach. By the righteous path, I am losing my mind. Damn it, I am actually losing my mind. I turned around fast like lightning and hastened to my desk, upon which lay an open leather-bound folio. It was a handwritten transcription of the path that I had started just before the festivities of Star Summer Night. For 5 decades now, it had been possible to reproduce written works in an almost magical manner, thanks to the strange press-like construction of a cunning starling researcher. It was called letterpress, due to the mechanics of the machine. Manual transcription, however, was still considered a sign of spiritual commitment. There was something meditative about it. It was calming, which was what I needed to banish the rising panic. Hastily, I adjusted my chair, opened the inkwell, and took the quill. Work frees the mind, I told myself. I was encouraged by the fact that the barrage of strange images and the feeling they brought on had subsided. It had been a dream, nothing more. A frightening dream indeed, but a dream nonetheless. Yes, concentrate, write a few pages, recite a verse, and the spook will be gone. Nothing will remind me of the disfigured body in the coffin, of you, and tomorrow I will be able to continue my meaningless life. Indeed, it will be business as usual, and then one day I will die in peace, without having seen the truth at all, an insignificant pale number among thousands, and no one will ever remember you, Jael Tanner's son, the nameless one, and only now did I realize that sweat was pouring down my forehead, and that I was clenching the quill so hard that my hand was starting to hurt. The sentences I had written were scrawly and full of mistakes. I dropped the quill. Witchcraft! This is witchcraft! I slammed the book shut, closed my eyes, and attempted to clear my mind, like Mater Pilea had taught me. Breathe, Jael, breathe. My entire body trembled, my pulse hammered in my wrists. There was no doubt that the voice came from within me. It was part of my thoughts, yet so unfamiliar, threatening, and lurking. It is futile, Jael, the voice suddenly whispered. You cannot escape destiny. End your false life, end it here and now, and follow the fire. There was a moment of silence. Or else you will die. As the last word faded from my mind, fear exploded inside me. It shot up my spine and spread from there, to my heart, to my fingertips, to my skull, straight into my brain. Again and again, I pictured the horror from my dream, interspersed with strange memories of seemingly random moments in my life. I saw myself pacing between the benches of the temple without orientation. I saw myself preparing a corpse for its last journey according to Enderalian tradition, weeping. I saw myself lying feverishly in bed, breathing heavily and eyes wide open. But it were not the images which made the situation so unbearable. It was the suffocating sensation that covered everything like a leaden grey cloud, threatening to drive me insane. Fear and panic, bitter loneliness and desolation. I felt as if I was standing at the edge of a pitch-black abyss, lost and without identity. I felt alone. It might be hard for you to comprehend the description, but perhaps it helps if I attempt to explain how the human mind functions. If something terrible happens to someone, such as the death of a loved one, our mind reacts with a kind of shock. Only part of what we should be feeling is allowed to enter the immediate conscious experience. The rest is banished to the depths of our subconscious, buried like an unloved, dangerous secret. Once the mind has recovered somewhat, the banished remains of the memory will be unearthed, piece by piece, so that we can deal with them and complete the mourning process. If, for some reason, this reworking does not take place, the memories will decay and fester until their presence becomes noticeable. We feel gloomy, suffer from panic attacks, or lose the ability to feel emotions entirely. Though it is impossible to live under such conditions until one dies, the buried memories consume much of our vital energy, and in the worst case, drives us to strange deeds. When the tentacles of fear raged in me, I realized these terrible feelings were exactly such decomposing memories. They had been there forever, lurking shadows beneath a shield of glass. I had noticed them in brief moments, small and insignificant, sometimes in the deepest of night when I awoke from a nightmare, clammy with sweat and unable to recall what I had just dreamt. Sometimes in small fissures of thought which haunted me while I performed a perfectly normal task. For a few heartbeats, I was filled with a misty, grey loneliness, and I felt as if I was an observer of myself, the spectre of a hypocritical, bigoted play, my false life. I lived a lie, a desperate effort of my mind to conceal something in me that could not be concealed, a secret, something I had suppressed and could not hold at bay any longer. Now it had broken free and remorselessly showed me what would happen if I did not begin to search for the truth. Death. You are dying. Yet some among you might realize that insights and actions are very opposing things. Even though the voice had forced me to look at it, and I had looked at it, I did not want to accept it. I uttered a guttural cry, threw my writing utensils off the desk, and knocked down my stool. With my bare fist, I hit the wall of my chamber, ignoring the burning pain that shot up my arm. I wanted to banish the feeling inside me somehow, so I could get my old life back. But my resistance was in vain, and every second that passed amplified the panic, constricting my throat, drowning me like an overpowered flood. Only when my breath was but a weak gasp, I sank to the floor, back against the wall, face buried in my hands, exhausted. It is futile. I felt the salt of my tears burning on my cheeks and sobbed like a child. What shall I do? By Malthus, what shall I do? I uttered with a shaky, miserable voice. For a while, nothing happened. Then I heard the voice again, in my thoughts, tender, melancholic. You already know the answer, JL. She told you what to do. This time, the voice did not aggravate my loneliness. No, for a moment, I almost felt secure, and in this moment, I made my decision. Yes, she was right. I knew what I had to do. I knew it, and had always known it. Yet, like a fledgling soldier who did not understand that the tales about glorious wars were merely tales until he lost his leg, I had had to see my own death in order to understand. I had to start searching for the buried truth. At the time, it was obscure to me what the veiled woman had meant by the fire. Was the fire a symbol of the truth? The truth behind the feeling of emptiness and loneliness I had learned to suppress and could not suppress anymore? The newborn man, who later became known as the Butcher of Ark, did not yet know that he would soon find the answer to this question. My memories of the hours immediately after my decision are only vague. It would be wrong to assume that the oppressive feeling in my stomach had vanished after I'd gained insight into its nature. No, it was still there, and each time doubt surfaced while I was packing my belongings, it grew stronger and more present, like a master who was determined to keep a weak-minded student on the right path by using reprimand and sharp words. Yet I felt a determination I had never felt before in my life. Indeed, I felt a spirit of optimism, as absurd as it might sound after what had happened to me. After I'd collected my belongings, I left the temple, which had been my home for more than a decade. One last time, I took in its awe-inspiring interior. There it stood, Malthus's stone statue, clad in a massive steel harness, looking ahead with determination. In his left hand, the statue held a replica of broken chains. The right hand pointed forward, showing the way, proudly and full of power. One last time, I closed my eyes and smelled the omnipresent mixture of incense, lavender, and roses, a scent which used to provide comfort. Now, it tickled unpleasantly in my nose and reminded me of the ointment the inhabitants of the Isles of Calais used to embalm their dead. Swallowing heavily, I closed the door behind me. The contents of the satchel that hung over my shoulder were scarce: a loaf of fresh Enderalian bread, a water skin, my scratchy cotton blanket, a sachet of pennies, and the Holy 101 verses, which I decided to bring along after a moment of hesitation. The book felt heavy, and its leather binding seemed rough and, well, sticky. Why is it sticky? Nonetheless, my attachment to the Lightborn, whose holy word formed the spiritual compass for any devout Enderalian, and who had been my only companion in my lonesome life so far, except for Mater Pylea, was too deep. One thing was clear to me: wherever my journey would lead me, I needed food and decent clothing. My priest's robes were too heavy and cumbersome, and they would be too warm in the summer. They also seemed like a burden to me, completely inappropriate for the task ahead. Even though every traveller, brigands aside, would treat me with respect, the robes were a symbol of my old life as a priest. So I had to visit the marketplace and find a trader who would sell his wares despite the holy day. It felt strange to see the place that usually was full of people so empty and quiet. Only a dog noticed my presence, plus a few chickens and a corral surrounded by an alcove of the weak town wall. The sun had risen in the meantime, but the many grey clouds did not allow much light to shine down on the city. It was going to rain. Eventually, I reached my destination, a small and cozy store. The house walls were overgrown with ivy, which framed even the milky windows beneath the crooked roof. A hand cart full of barrels and crates in front of the entrance looked as if it had been abandoned by its owner during work, which was likely considering the smell of alcohol, gunpowder, and fried meat in the air. Garlands, which would have shone in all colours if enough sunlight had been present, hung limply between the houses. Several times I heard a crunch when I stepped on the shards of broken jugs. The sign next to the heavy door identified the shop as Carvet's Sundries. I knocked, and I knocked again, when a few minutes had passed without any reaction. Finally, after the third round of knocking, I heard the sound of scuffling steps, and an aged starling with clean-shaven face and a sharp nose opened the door. His tired expression told me he had intended to chase off the unwanted customer before he recognized me. The dark circles under his eyes betrayed he was likely among those who had vigorously celebrated Star Summer Night. Briefly, the sight struck me as bizarre, even familiar, as if I had experienced it many times before. However, the feeling was gone the moment the merchant spoke with a worn voice. "Well, father?" He glanced uncertainly at the embroidered emblem of a stylized eye and sword on my robe. "Can I help you?" I tried to smile. "Indeed you can, by showing me your wares. May I enter?" I was surprised by how confident and friendly my voice sounded. Carvet regarded me with sleepy confusion. Like all starlings, he was small and wiry, had frizzy hair and a pointy nose. Carvet was a path-abiding man. Every week, he and his many children visited the three masses, which was the reason I had chosen his store to purchase clothes for my ludicrous journey. His respect for the clergy was great, so he would not ask questions. I did see the question why, by the righteous path, a village priest would visit a store this early in the morning, on a day most people were recovering from a night of revelry and celebration in his eyes, but my estimation proved correct. He did not voice it. Instead, the merchant nodded devotedly, stepped aside, and let me in. Unlike the somber landscape surrounding Fogville, Carvet's house had a rustic and cozy feel. The fireplace in the large room at the end of the hall was crackling, and for a second I spotted a young girl peeking through a door at the top of the stairs, on the right of the entrance. I envied the starling child and her siblings. Their father had given them a home and a sense of security I had never had with Gilman. When Pylia had taken me under her wings, it had already been too late. The wooden walls looked solid but old, and the large fur of a coast stalker hung on the left side. Reluctantly, I took a step forward and almost tripped over one of the many shoes on the floor. I heard the door behind me slam shut and Carvet clear his throat. "This way, father," he said, and walked toward the large sale room from which I had heard the crackle of fire. It was an amazing sight behind the wooden counter. Behind the wooden counter which separated the seller's realm from the customer's, numerous items, chests, boxes, and pieces of furniture were piled up. Huge bookshelves along the walls were filled with dusty folios, scrolls, crystals, and small caskets. The store looked insignificant from outside, but I suspected some precious antiquities could be found here. "Well, what exactly do you need, father?" the starling finally inquired. I was unable to answer, taken aback by my own uncertainty. What did I actually need? I wanted to embark on a journey to find the mysterious woman from my dream, and I had a hunch that it might not end in Enderal. "Well," I started, "everything you need for an extended journey." Carvet's brow furrowed. "A journey? To where?" Apparently realizing his indiscretion, he quickly added, "If you don't mind the question." "I am traveling to Ark," I improvised. The longer before he would tell anyone about my getaway, the better. The High Priest asks for us. That seemed to satisfy the merchant. "I understand." He lifted the hatch in the counter. "I am all the more honored by your visit to my store." I nodded and let him walk me through his wares. About half an hour later, I was relieved of 102 pennies and had purchased a sturdy knapsack, a good pair of boots, a hooded traveller's cowl, and an old iron dagger, which I did not know how to use. Carvet had also sold me a traveller's staff he said was favoured by pilgrims who visited the 7 way shrines. "It is perfect for repelling insects," he had told me trustworthily. That sounds like a scam, but okay. As a farewell, I had blessed him and left with a priestly smile. I continued to the tavern to get provisions for my journey. The matron, defying his lack of sleep, was diligently cleaning up the remains of the festivities. He responded to my early visit with confusion as well, but after some explanation about my plans, he sold me a loaf of tasty bread, dried fruit, and a tub of pickled whisperweed, which was popular among travelers because of its durability, for a good price. He also asked for my priestly blessing, which I gave him with a strange feeling. The holy act felt more wrong than ever before, and the ceremony seemed not like routine, but a lie to me. The guardsman Yeelies was the last person I encountered before I got to walk down the hill upon which Fogville was located. He was too tired to ask my destination. Obediently, he opened the wooden gate and wished me to walk blessed. As I left Fogville behind, melancholic relief washed over me. Within a few hours, I had ended the life the veiled woman had described as false. Nobody would notice my absence until late in the day. The Butcher of Ark, Volume 3. First Steps. The first days of my journey were an almost spiritual yet not entirely pleasant experience. I felt as if I had lived my whole life wearing a veil over my eyes. The greater the distance to the barren cliff with Fogville became, the more surreal it seemed that I had lived there for 28 years. As a priest, it almost felt as if it had been merely a dream. After all, who was I? I was unable to find a satisfying answer to that question. If I did not end my foolish journey and return immediately, I would become a heretic, a pathless one, in the eyes of the Holy Order, someone who had strayed from his path. The fact that I belonged to the clergy was of lesser concern to me. When I thought of Malthus and his 101 verses, doubt and bitterness pierced my sense of liberation like a mental sword. Yet the thought of returning sparked a similar reaction. That dull feeling in my stomach lurked inside me. When I tried to take a few steps back towards Fogville on the second day of my journey, the very same terrible panic arose which had led to the breakdown in my chamber. No, the only path for me to take now was the one leading through my suppressed memories, away from my false life. I had not the slightest idea where to start looking for the lost fragments of my childhood. I had only been 2 years old when Gilman had found me. What could have happened to shape my life to such an extent? I had only one clue to find answers. The ominous words of the veiled woman. To trust these words was as foolish and irrational as trusting a Kyranian bone reader, but I had no choice. Follow the fire. I halted for a moment and wiped the sweat from my forehead. After I had descended from the Fogville cliff, I had followed a narrow path along the coast. I had now reached the border to the heartland. Ark was about 11 days' march away, but I intended to use my last pennies to pay a Myrad flight to the capital. The overgrown tracks through the Enderalian forest were too dangerous. Currently, I walked on an unpaved road between colourful meadows, a temporary interruption of the forests that surrounded me for most of the route. The sound of birds was in the air, and the sun was burning on the back of my neck. "You're insane, JL. Simply insane," I thought as I looked back. Indeed, what I did was contradicting everything the holy verses had taught me. Only about 7 turns of the moon ago, I had accompanied a small group of boys and girls of appropriate age through their consecration. I remembered how a bright, red-haired Eterna girl had spoken to me during one of the preparatory lessons. Her hair was fine and straight, like it usually was for the pointy-eared race. What if I would not want to become a tailoress, she had asked me after I explained the importance of their upcoming names day ceremony to the children. "What is your name, young girl?" I had answered smilingly. The determined look had not vanished from her eyes. "Silena, father. My name is Silena." "Silena. Very well. Let me give you a small riddle. Or rather, let me give you all a small riddle." She had furrowed her brows and looked at me skeptically, more like a grown woman than a young girl. "Picture yourself as brave explorers. It is your holy mission, personally assigned to you by the Grand Master of the Order, to discover new land far beyond the Scarag Isles, just as the first pioneers did in Enderal." The blank or bored looks on the children's faces had been replaced by curiosity. Only Silena had continued to regard me with determined skepticism. "However," I had said pointedly, raising my index finger, "a great disaster happens to you, a thunderstorm. You are only halfway when your galley is torn apart by a tempest. You are lucky because none of you are hurt, but you find yourself on a wild, deserted island. There is nothing but thickets, cold sand, and wreckage around you." With the exception of Silena, all of them had been drawn into my tale at that point. You all know that if you want to survive, you need to act, at once. For not only bitter cold and hunger could be your doom, you can hear a threatening growl from afar, a sound that only a wild Vatir can bring forth. When I mentioned the hideous goat-like creatures which usually live in dark, moist caves, some of the children had uttered the noises of disgust. So you start collecting wood and build a camp, but soon you realize that some of you are better qualified for certain tasks than others. Rayloff, Rayloff, for example, can carry twice as much wood as Silena because of his strong physique. You, Gilma, are a gifted markswoman because your father allowed you to practice with the straw dolls in the guardhouse at an early age. Now, who should keep the first watch and who should go looking for firewood? All children had agreed that Rayloff was supposed to carry the wood and Gilma to keep watch. The game had continued until all tasks had been assigned to the pioneers according to their physical and mental conditions. Well, I had continued my tale, but now something bothersome happens. Rayloff feels exploited and does not want to collect any more firewood. The boy had looked at me indignantly, but I reassured him with a gesture of my hand. Of course, he behaves like this only in my story. By all means, he does not want to go looking for firewood anymore. He says he wants to keep watch with Gilma, even though all of you know that he would not be able to hit a blind, paralyzed troll with his bow. Now my question to you is this: what would be the best for all of you? If Rayloff came to reason, or if he kept watch from now on, and Gilma collected wood instead? The children had voted unanimously for the first choice. Very well. Only this way you will be able to defy the tears, hunger, and cold on the inhospitable island until a galley arrives and bring you safely back to Enderal. This is the essence of what the Holy Scripture teaches us. Unity and strength can only emerge in a community that serves the welfare of all and not just of an individual. Malthus himself chooses our divine tasks, for who else knows our strengths and weaknesses better than the one who grants our mothers the gift of fertility each moon? With a satisfied smile, my gaze had wandered back to the one who initially had asked the question. And that, dear Silena, is the answer to your question. Even if you have doubts about the path Malthus is soon going to choose for you, defy them as you defy a disease, for only a people united in flesh and mind will be able to prevail eternally. The children's answer had been content silence. Silena, however, had not lost her skeptical expression, even after I had finished my story, which had been inspired by the first verse of the path. The path, had I ever believed in it, I did not know. It was what Mother Pylea had told me. It was what I was supposed to believe. If even I, an educated man with access to such knowledge, was only able to discover the decayed memories of childhood after a vision, what about other people? Do they all live a false life? But if, it shot through my mind, the path is indeed a lie, what guides us then? This heretical thought kept me occupied until the sun set. The sun had disappeared almost entirely behind the horizon by the time I spotted signs of human life on the trail again. Like the 4 days before, I had been wandering through woods of pines and cypresses, encountering not a single human soul. But now a giant field of wheat stretched out before me, and in the middle of it stood a windmill tall as a tower. Its wheel turned slowly in the evening wind, and a mixture of dusty earth, moss, and freshly cut grass hung in the air. For a moment, the rustic beauty of the sight made me forget my aching legs and the dull feeling in my stomach. People. Despite my fatigue, I accelerated my steps and soon reached a paved road which wound between the hills, overgrown with wheat. After a short while, I found what I had been looking for, an inn. Night had fallen completely by now, and the orange light from the windows of the old ivy-covered farmhouse promised shelter and rest. A smile formed on my face, and I sighed with relief. The past few nights I had spent in small caverns, which my back, used to my soft bed, did not approve of. A warm meal. Suddenly, 2 horses dashed past me in full gallop. Instinctively, I jumped to the side. The flank of one of the horses barely missed me. I let out a scared cry, stumbling as I tried to regain my balance in vain. I landed in the dust with a muffled thud. What in blazes? Indignantly, I looked at the 2 riders who came to a halt in front of me. They were both very tall and wore solid leather garments like hunters. Their horses were black, indicating an expensive breed. Angrily, I watched them dismount, tossing a penny to a slender boy who was probably the stable lad, and disappear into the tavern. Even back then, I hated inconsiderate and crude people. Had these 2 apes even realized that they had almost run me down? Probably not, and if they did, they would not even look at you. My lips shrank to a thin line. Damn primitives. But my mind was too exhausted to allow any more angry thoughts. I shrugged in resignation, picked up my staff from the ground, and went to the farmhouse. The overwhelming sweet scent of freshly baked bread greeted me, and my anger dissolved. The last time I looked at the tavern sign swaying in the wind. The Red Ox. This was where I would spend the first civilized night of my new life. I entered the tavern to a pleasant buzz of voices, clanking goblets and crackling fire. The cold was quickly driven from my limbs. My mouth watered. During my long march, I had only eaten a few pieces of bread and a couple handfuls of whisperweed. The tavern looked well frequented, which explained the empty roads outside. I assumed that it served as the meeting point for the local farmers. There was enough space for about 30 souls here, and nearly every chair, stool, and bench was occupied. Torches illuminated the room and cast dancing shadows of the guests on the walls. I scanned the crowd. Next to the entrance, a tired-looking man studied a yellowed picture book called The Merry Eterna Damsel with great interest. Judging from what I could make out of its saucy images, they had not been drawn exclusively for ethnologists. A bearded bard turned his lute on a shamefully tiny pedestal. He was probably preparing for his next song to be devoured by the noise around him. Right in front of me sat an invariably attractive, well-dressed man who was engaged in a conversation with a woman whose countenance showed utter devotion. I estimated him to be 35 winters old. His hair was jet black, his face masculine yet delicate, with a 3-day stubble. My mouth distorted. He has to be a prick from the upper city, one of those who shirk around and waste their inheritance. Just as I finished the thought, the beau noticed my staring. For a few heartbeats, he looked at me with sparkling eyes and smiled, fetching and narcissistic at the same time. Then he turned back to his admirer. The other guests appeared to be travelers and farmers of all sorts, men and women, young and old, tall and short. I felt misplaced, like a Northman on a Kyranian bazaar, strange and uneasy among the rough people among whom I did not belong. Hastily, I stepped up to the counter, which was located under a lower part of the ceiling, and behind which various barrels and liquors were lined up. I was about to speak when I noticed the 2 clumsy figures seated on the high stools, the 2 apes. Now I had time to study them. One of them had a full beard and 2 strange earrings, which gave him the appearance of a buccaneer. His chum had no beard, but he did have a chin that looked like it could shatter walls of Northwind stone. I felt the urge to grab the mug in front of me and throw ale into their faces. The idea vanished, however, when the 2 took notice of me. Unwittingly, I ducked my head while they gave me an amused look before turning their attention back to their stew. They did not even recognize me. With a small nod, I summoned the barmaid, who was cleaning mugs behind the counter. She approached, sizing me up with vague curiosity. Mattress? What does that mean? What may I get you? At least she had the decency to address me as an urban citizen. I tried not to show my inner turmoil. A glass of goat's milk, please. I tried to sound masculine and confident, but my voice, coarse and untrained after 4 days of silence, was a pitiful croak. The reactions could not have been more intense had I asked for the crown jewels for the Golden Queen. While the barmaid only smiled and shook her head in sympathy, the 2 primitives next to me burst out laughing. Goat's milk, one of them roared, slapping his comrade's shoulder. He wants a glass of goat's milk. I stared at the giant, irritated but defiant. I could probably have avoided the events that followed had I not responded. Although numerous snappy answers passed through my head, the one I finally gave them, arms crossed in front of my chest, was pathetic. Yes, goat's milk, I replied with quivering voice. Do you have a problem with it? This only appeared to intensify the apes' hilarity. Their new round of laughter was so loud that even the bearded bard stopped playing his lute and, as many other guests turned his insulted yet curious gaze towards the counter. After they had finished laughing and patting each other's shoulders affirmatively, the buccaneer spoke to me. By no means, Mattress, he mustered a fainted sympathetic expression, a grin already on the verge of breaking through. It's just, unfortunately, the tavern is fresh out of goat's milk. Perhaps you want to try the Harlot's Inn in the bathhouse of Ark? I felt fierce anger arise in me. Never since I had become a priest had I been treated with such disrespect. Never. I will do that when I visit you next time in the ape's compound. I froze. The snappish retort had come from my mouth faster than I had been thinking, and the cheeriness of the two churls dissolved as quickly. From the corner of my eye, I saw almost half the guests follow the events with apprehension. You damn idiot. You damn miserable idiot. For a moment, the eyes of the buccaneer and his chum narrowed to slits. Then the anger left their faces and were replaced by a livid feistiness. Well, well, he drawled, sounding unmistakably vicious. So you're a real badass. I wanted to take a step back, but the buccaneer grabbed my wrist with his right hand. His grip was hard and firm, his fingers crude and full of calluses. I felt cold sweat breaking out all over my body. I realized that the man was primitive but dangerous. Half-heartedly, I tried to escape his hold. A convulsion the two men ignored easily. I'm sorry. The gorilla covered my mouth with his hand. He pointedly glanced at his chum, who sneered even more. I like brave people, but you seem to be exhausted from your long journey. The other man pushed something towards him over the counter. So how about a little refreshment? With that, he released my mouth, grabbed the bowl, and poured its contents over my head. It was stew, and if the encounter had occurred a few minutes earlier, the broth would probably have scalded my skin. Nevertheless, I was covered in hot, sticky slime. Shocked, I gasped for air, inadvertently inhaling some of the broth. I broke down coughing and panting. The meaty brew dripped down my hair, and some of it found its way into my garment, running down my spine. I heard roaring laughter around me. I was certainly that most of it came from the buccaneer and his chum, but some of those who had watched the events were now laughing as well. My stomach cramped, shame rising up within me. There I was, degraded, coughing stew and the laughing stock. I felt the impulse to jump up and grab the buccaneer's throat, but my reason suppressed it instantly. I was deeply humiliated, but I had no death wish, so I tried to raise myself up in a controlled and dignified manner and remove pieces of meat from my clothes. Indeed, my indifference and serenity would be enough of a lesson for the two brutes. I gathered all my priestly courage and turned around. They looked at me amused and challenging. They want me to keep acting defiantly, I thought. They want me to keep provoking them. I did not stand the slightest chance against any of them in close combat, that was certain. After all, I had as much knowledge of brawls as a troll about hair care. Just leave, JL. Leave and swallow your damn pride. I peered at the crowd. Most of the guests had returned to their meals or conversations. Only a few of them still looked at me expectantly. Among them, the black-haired beau. Nobody seemed to despise the impudence of the two men at all. Abruptly, I realized what had protected me from events like this my entire life. My priest's robe. It had been the only reason why the other boys had stopped mocking me after my consecration. And it likely was the only reason why everyone had lowered their heads devoutedly, or at least had had the decency not to pour stew over me when I entered a tavern. You are nobody, JL. Without your priest's robe, you are just another common man. Neither big nor slim, neither old nor young, neither ugly nor handsome. Meaningless. I briefly considered drawing the priest's brooch, which I had not had the heart to leave behind, from my bag. Oh, how they would look at me, the primitives. They would begin to recite the prayer of the path with eyes widened by fear, asking me for forgiveness. They would respect me, what you represent. Yes, they would bow their heads in reverence because they fear the power of the Holy Order. Of course they would. To disregard a priest of the path was a capital crime, and only a fool would risk such a punishment. No, to reveal myself as a priest would not only mean to rely on the authority of others, but also to return to my false life. I already felt my stomach constricting warningly. I had to comply, so I took a deep breath and swallowed my fervent shame. Ignoring the mocking glances of the buccaneers, I silently gave the barmaid a sign that I wanted a room for the night. I had no desire for a meal anymore, even less in the presence of those who had witnessed my humiliation. The barmaid nodded pitifully and told an old man who sat quietly by the counter and looked undefinably at me to show me the way. In silence, I followed the old man up to the room. Only when I stood in front of the room's door, I felt the malice of the brutes, which cut like a sword in my back, began to wane. I gave the old man 5 pennies, and he handed me the key, a burning candle and a cloth for cleaning, which was probably meant as a benevolent gesture, but only intensified my shame. I turned around silently, entered my chamber, and locked the door behind me. Anger overcame me like a flood. Without taking notice of the bed, I moved to the window and stared into the rain. I let out a suppressed shout, closed my eyes, and clawed both my hands into the window ledge. By the Black Guardian, I was angry. Of course, the rational part of me knew that I had gotten off cheaply. In other, seedier taverns, people left to brawl with a broken arm or worse. However, I was unwilling to accept the events and put them aside. Did these men have no respect? This kind of scum deserved to be hanged, flayed and skinned like brigands and marauders, preferably in public. My jaw cramped, and I became aware of the feeling in my stomach starting to change. The dull twang of insecurity had transformed into flaming rage, encaged in iron determination. I will not begin my new life in disgrace. I opened my eyes and looked at the candle the innkeeper had given me. The flame sputtered and flickered. In a strange way, its fire strengthened my determination. I wanted to teach the two apes a lesson, even if it was the last thing I did. But how? What can I do except preaching, reading books, and mixing herbs? I stilled. Yes. Now I was almost grateful that the two disrespectful primitives had crossed my path, right here and now. A malicious grin bloomed on my lips as I turned my gaze back to the window. For a short time, I marveled at the man staring at me from the silent glass. His pale blue eyes were like burning ice, a contradiction that seemed to be as natural to him as the fire of the sun in autumn twilight. He no longer resembled the cringing priest who had given the blessing to washerwoman only a week ago. Yes, the man emitted something akin to power, determination, fire. The Butcher of Arc, Volume 4, Ashes. Chapter 4, Ashes. It must have been around 2 o'clock at night when I put my plan into action. The voices from downstairs had started to fade around midnight, but I did not want to take any unnecessary risks. Cautiously, I set foot outside my room and peered into the hallway leading to the stairs down to the tap room. However, I quickly withdrew at the sound of stumbling on the stairs. I closed the door behind me and listened. A woman and a man, likely drunk, judging by the irregularity of their steps. Could it be one of the two brutes? No, his voice sounded too bright, too soft, too tired. I waited until they had passed my room and I heard a door opening and closing. Then I snuck out into the hallway again. Now it was deserted. I crept towards the stairs and peeked down to the tap hall. Nobody. Even the maidservant and the host appeared to have retired for the night, and only the typical smell of grease, alcohol, and sweat reminded of the patrons who had indulged themselves a few hours ago. I nodded contentedly as if to reassure myself and returned to my room once more. If the tap room was empty, chances were there was nobody outside either, with the possible exception of a sentinel, perhaps a beefy farmer's son who wished to earn a few extra coins. Carefully, I checked the utensils I had gathered for my revenge before I tied the leather pouch containing them around my waist. I pulled the hood of my vagabond's gear low over my face and congratulated myself with its purchase again. The window was opened without effort or noise. I pushed the blinds, which ought to protect the room from the cold of night, open. Just a soft creaking. Slowly, I climbed on the windowsill. A soothing, almost thumping warmness spread through my insides despite the cold wind. It was as if I drew power from that strange, dull feeling in my stomach. I looked down the wall and surveyed the situation, filled with a sense of gratification. Indeed, I was less muscular and strong than the brutes, but I was agile and flexible instead. My hands were long and slim, perfectly suited for my purpose. I was lucky in two ways. First, the host had given me a room on the second floor, not the third. Secondly, just a few feet below me was the roof of a small porch, which probably sheltered the sentinel from rain. As I lowered myself from the sill, luck decided to smile on me for a third time. The tip of my boots were only a few fingers' breadth away from the roof. I inhaled deeply and released the ledge. I landed with muffled impact, not loud enough to raise suspicion. Now I had to be quick. Any second out here could be the moment that someone caught sight of me. I snuck along the porch and descended from the edge. A gust of wind made my vagabond's garment flutter, nature's dramatic addition to the scene. The stables where the brutes had left their horses were in front of me. The building was an unremarkable extension of the tavern, standing in the blue, moonlit the blue of the moonlit night in perfect silence. As I came closer, I heard the heavy breath of horses, the scraping of hooves, and the crinkle of hay. Carefully, I pulled at the heavy iron door handle. The door swung open with ease. You might well ask why an unlocked stable door did not arouse any suspicion in me. The truth is that I was too consumed by the blazing determination my bold plan of revenge had ignited to question my fourth lucky streak. I ventured inside without a glimmer of doubt. Only 5 horses were in the stable, 2 of them sleeping. A grey nag in a compartment next to the door glanced at me with a look that could have been classified as skepticism, but the animal quickly lost interest and continued to chew on the hay. It was not difficult to find the steeds of my tormentors, pitch black and muscular as they were. They stood at the very end of the horse wing in a chamber separated by a fragile wooden door. Now the time had come. Cautiously, I knelt in front of the compartment of the first steed, near the manger. I could not suppress a twinge of envy as I inspected the horse from up close. Even an amateur like me could see that it was a Scaragian rock stallion. I quarreled with myself for several seconds. Who were these men that they could afford such noble horses? And what would befall me if they ever got scent of the fact that I was responsible for what would happen to them in the morning? Maybe all this is the first time in your life that you show courage. These 2 bastards have earned a lesson in humility. Of course, the voice was right. I was right. To recoil now would be an act of cowardice, a shame I did not want to live with. Indeed, these 2 had earned a lesson in humility, and I was going to give it to them. My fingers slid into the leather pouch at my side, felt out the small phial, and pulled it out. Sheercap dust. The eponymous mushrooms usually grew in sparsely vegetated, stony landscapes, and the cliff where Fogville was situated on was exactly such an area. The application of these fungi was one of the first things Mother Pylea taught me when I was a novice. Mixing the dry powder with whisper-tree resin resulted in a sticky pulp, which accelerated the healing rate considerably when applied to an open wound. Since whisper trees grew in nearly every area of Enderal, except for the barren lands of Thalgard, the Frostcliff Mountains, and the Powder Desert, it was highly advisable to bring a phial of concentrated sheercap powder on extended journeys. The substance provided protection from various ailments and afflictions, perhaps most importantly inflammation, for those who knew the correct dosage of the 2 components. However, the cap's powder had an additional effect which was unknown to the common people. If it reached the stomach of an unfortunate fellow in an excessive concentration, it triggered something that would be best described as a cascade of rage. Negative feelings such as grief, hate, and anger were amplified many times over. An irascible man would lose his temper even faster than usual. A gloomy, heartbroken woman would be suffering unbearably to the point of a full breakdown. The effect of concentrated sheercap powder mixed into a meal equaled the feelings of a trained psionist could evoke in his victims. The only difference was that the powder needed 7 or 8 hours to take effect. In this case, though, I welcomed the delay, as you can imagine. According to my plan, the 2 brutes, full of arrogance and pride, would be mounting their expensive stallions, only to be thrown to the ground by the befuddled horses in full gallop. The animals would likely run off, leaving the primitives behind with considerable bruises or fractures. Back then, I was shocked by the gratification, arousal even, this thought brought me. A smile formed on my lips while I uncorked the phial and walked towards the sleeping horses. I did not have to search long for the trough. It contained a pap of hay, mashed apples, and rancid water. Probably a meal the splendid animals were not accustomed to, yet it was tasty enough to sate their appetite. I crouched down in front of the bucket, which had been placed at the end of the hallway between the 2 compartments, poured 2 small piles of powder on my hand, and mixed it into the food. Once that was done, I carried the trough to the compartment, swung it back and forth in front of the horses, and murmured something I hoped was encouraging to gently wake up a warhorse. I did not have to wait long. The first horse opened one eye and gave me an indefinable glance. Sleepily, it shook its head, as if the mental classification of my presence meant too much effort at this late hour, fluttered its lips, and dipped its head into the trough. It's working. Damn it, it is working. The thrill of anticipation which had vibrated within me when I entered the stable mingled with glowing triumph, and I felt even more excited than ever. Strange, indeed. There I was, a young priest of about 30 winters, playing a prank on two brutes who had been bullying me. However, instead of feeling impish or cheeky, I saw myself as a personification of justice, an avenging angel who contributed to the betterment of humanity with his actions. Well, I admit it was a fairly generous interpretation of the circumstances, and the first beat of a butterfly's wings occurred, as the veiled woman would say. I was so consumed by satisfaction that I did not perceive my surroundings. I only heard the scuffling of steps behind me, when it was already too late. A heavy paw landed on my shoulder. Startled, I turned my head. My first mistake. Now the buccaneer was able to identify my face, which had been concealed by the shadow of my hood. He seemed to realize what I was doing straight away. "You lousy swine," he snarled, half statement, half question. His breath reeking of alcohol was the last thing that registered with me before his right fist clashed into my face. I heard a sharp snap and felt a burning pain shoot up my head. The blow's force threw me back and had me collapse on the sparsely distributed pieces of hay on the floor. My head reverberated as if the pillars of the Sun Temple had dropped down on it. "Miserable son of a whore," the buccaneer's voice resounded amid the buzzing that rang in my ear. "You haven't had enough, have you?" Disoriented from the pain, I attempted to crawl forward, but immediately felt an exploding pain in my right side as the giant thrust his thick leather boot in my side. "Huh? What is your problem, you piece of crap?" he shouted, full of rage. "What is your damn problem?" Another kick followed, this time against my ribs. I could hear them cracking noisily, and for a moment I was unable to breathe. I was foolish enough not to understand that the buccaneer's questions were not questions but expressions of rage, so I held up my hand and tried to offer an explanation for my presence. "Here." As a result, his boot struck my head and my face was dashed against the hard stone floor. I felt hot blood running down my forehead, my cheeks and my nose, and for a couple of seconds my vision blackened. Using the last of my strength, I curled up like a child in its mother's womb, in hopes that the position would allow me to endure the force of his attacks. "You miserable fool," I thought. "You damn fool, he is going to kill you, damn it. He's going to kill you." Over and over I cursed myself while anticipating the next kick, but no kick came. Confused, I dared to open my eyes and raised my head a little. I could barely make out anything in the dark with all the blood in my eyes. The giant had turned away from me and knelt before his horse, worriedly caressing it. The soothing words he whispered to the animal were in stark contrast to the brutish shouting which had accompanied his assault. He does not recognize me, I realized through the pain. He does not even recognize me as a threat. What happened next, and most importantly what I experienced, will be hard to put into words. I remember how I suddenly felt the leather sheath of my iron dagger. I had considered it wise to keep it disguised and had it on me simply because I had forgotten to leave it in my room in the tavern. Everything happened faster than I was able to think, instinctively, bestially. Anyone who has received a well-trained, hard blow to the nose knows how painful it is. However, my pain vanished in an instant, and I became aware of how the dull feeling in my stomach, the feeling which had shaped into determination and anticipation at the premise of my failed act of vengeance, began to transform. If a feeling had a form, it transformed after my last thoughts had run their course. Degenerate bastard, first you humiliate me without reason in front of all of those people, and now you dare to spoil my revenge? The anger in my stomach smoldered. In a matter of seconds, my body was soaked with sweat. I trembled. He is going to pay for this. The subhuman, the worthless piece of filth that considered himself above the law, merely because of his bloated upper arms and his physique. Indeed, some people do not deserve a place on this world. Quietly bristling with rage, I drew my dagger. My arm had been strangely twisted by the kicks, but I ignored the pain. It did not exist anymore. It was only me and my enemy, and then I was there. With a force I did not think my slim arms were capable of, I drove the dagger into the brute's back. Surprised and stunned, the gorilla gasped and spun around. Now there was no hint of malice and mocking in his eyes. Instead, I saw bewilderment, as if what was about to happen did not belong to the realm of possibility. Then it changed to plain, bestial rage. He grabbed my throat with both hands and lifted me off the ground, so I dangled like a convict from the gallows. The dagger stuck in his back as if it had been there from the day of his birth. I felt his strong fingers dig into my windpipe, cutting off my air, but the moment I looked into the man's eyes, I knew his end was nigh. It burned inside of me, an archaic, destructive force, and a volatile cocktail of rage, euphoria, and a flush of victory coursed through my veins. My mind, every part of my body. With full force, I slammed the tip of my boot between his legs. The man let out a tormented wail, released my neck, and doubled over. I did not hesitate for a second. I reached for the hilt of the dagger protruding from his back, and yanked it free, only to plunge it into his flesh in a different place. This time I encountered resistance, so I altered the angle of the weapon and turned it jerkily. The man roared, his voice no longer sounding human. Weak and disoriented, he tried to fall backwards and thus throw himself on me, but it was in vain. You dare to evade your punishment, the voice in my head ranted. After all you did to me, you dare to resist me, huh? Once more I struck him with my dagger, driving it into his thigh. Again he staggered, gasping unintelligible words. This time he did not try to fight back. Instead, he sank to his knees and started to whimper. He wants me to stop. An insane, triumphant grin spread across my face. This piece of crap truly wants mercy. However, I did not grant him mercy. I threw myself upon him and knocked him on his side. As I straddled him, it hit me that a stranger who at this very moment watched our silhouettes would have considered us a couple in love play. A laugh left my throat, followed by another, louder one. The way he was lying there, the oafish, remorseless giant looked at me with delirious eyes full of fear, like a boy who is about to receive a well-deserved spanking from his father. His steed did not appear concerned in the slightest. Please don't, he whispered, blood gushing from his mouth. What happened then will be difficult to describe. First, I was overcome by a wave of demonic joy and broke out in manic laughter. I threw my head back and laughed, loud and ringing. An ecstatic frenzy swept through my bones, my veins, my body. By the Black Guardian, I felt alive. I felt as if I had lived surrounded by heavy fog, which had only been blown away just now, as if I had taken a shadow on the wall for the thing that was casting it. Like a priest who killed a sacrificial lamb, I took hold of the dagger with both my hands, raised it above my head, and drove it into the brute's chest. In the very instant that the poignant sound of steel penetrating flesh occurred, something transpired that changed my life forever. For a short time, I became the man I killed. Indeed, I became him and stayed myself at the same time, as paradoxical as it may sound to you. A wave of unknown memories swept across my mind. I saw the brute, hands dripping with the blood of a Scaragaean man. I saw him in a dark room holding a black piece of cloth, weeping. I saw him together with his chum, it was his brother, in a large stone hall, standing in a circle of people who held each other's hands. Each of the images appeared with the force of a striking hammer, and with every new image the tingle increased, the flaming delight in my body intensified, and the obsession controlling my actions grew, became more consuming. Feed me, the dark part of myself cried, louder and stronger with every vision that appeared to me. Feed me with his flames. With shaking hands and covered in sweat, I withdrew the dagger from the giant's lifeless remains, only to drive it into his chest once more, even more forcefully than before. Again, memories that were not mine flooded my mind the moment the dagger sank between two ribs, revealing themselves to me on the rhythm of an adrenaline-fueled heartbeat. Every new image brought ecstasy, building and building until it left no room for other sensations. I uttered a noise that was meant to be a sigh of pleasure, but left my mouth as a manic, demonic croak. By the righteous path, I experienced a feeling of rapture like never before. I am alive, my thoughts cried, while I lifted the blade for the next blow. I live and I judge. The blade dashed down again and pierced the lifeless flesh beneath the memories. Ecstasy. His red lifeblood splattered on my face and mixed with my own hot and sticky, but I did not care. No, I cared about nothing at all, for I would judge, kill, punish him for his sins, stab for stab, memory for memory, until nothing remained of him, nothing but cold, lifeless ashes. Even now, almost a year later, my palms grow moist and my breath quickens when I recall this memory. The ink becomes darker and the quill snaps on the parchment. but you will not be able to understand my feelings as a damned being from an irrational point of view. There are numerous reasons for this. First of all, it is very likely that you are disgusted by my account. You are right to be, for I describe a barbaric act in an almost celebratory manner. However, it is only way to make you understand my thoughts to at least some extent. The second reason, which is a tribute to the first, is the one that carries the most weight. There are things you can only truly understand if you experience them yourselves. Among them are sex, the thrill of pain during a deadly fight, and not at least the end of life itself, death. How exquisitely we can reason upon the latter, creating theoretical models to explain its nature, from the teachings of the path to the chants of the monks from Arizale, or the reasoning of a philosopher's mind. Yet ultimately it makes no difference. We will not truly comprehend it till the moment we face it ourselves. The ecstasy which had gotten hold of my body like the blue death seized a wild mage's mind was all of the above and none of it. It was the fire. It filled me up, burned in every part of my body. My limbs felt boiling hot, and my heart was beating insanely within the confinements of my chest. What I had done seemed morbidly wonderful, lofty, even stimulating, and in a perverted manner, sexual. I did not believe for a second that I had done anything wrong. No, there was no right or wrong. There was only me and the driving force inside of me, originating from somewhere separate from gods, demons, and the laws of this world. I was judge. My will was my sword, and the brute the convict. There was nothing more. My movements were instinctive, archaic, pure. What I did was simply the consequences of intrinsic circumstances. Just like a wolf tearing a lamb apart, I did only what I, J.L. Tennyson, had to do in this moment. At least until the fire expired. How late might it have been? The cock's crow had not sounded yet, but a few birds chirped in the dense forest past the wheat fields. One of the steeds was still asleep, despite all the ruckus from the fight. The other stallion scraped its hooves impatiently over the hay-covered ground. I had not moved a bit after my final stab. The man who some hours ago had mocked me lay beneath me, battered and disfigured. The dark blood on my hands was beginning to dry. Unmoving and rigid as a wax doll, I knelt by my work. At one point, I had experienced a zenith of sorts. As mentioned earlier, I had felt more burning and ecstatic with every stab. The flames inside me had grown and grown, until it was like an enormous infernal pillar of flames had shot up from my stomach to my eyes, blazing, hot, searing. Now my reason was starting to return. Less and less I thought with the diffuse voice in my mind. More and more I became J.L. Tennyson again, born in Fogville, a pathless priest, and a murderer. The realization of what I had done finally sunk in. But like with a warrior after a nerve-wracking battle, my mind and body were too spent, too weak from the exertion to be able to think straight. So I let the dagger drop from my cramped fingers, tilted my head back, closed my eyes, and listened to the silence. 10 minutes passed, 15, half an hour. Only when footsteps approached the stable did I break free from my rigor. But still, I find myself incapable of acting accordingly. A good boy wipes the dirt off his plate, shot through my head all of a sudden. Slowly, I shifted my gaze in the direction where the sounds had come from. It was the buccaneer's brother. Briefly, the fire lit up inside me again, and I smiled, an almost indulgent smile, at the man who stared at the carnage in disbelief. Then it dissolved, too tired, too weak, sated. The brute's hand crept towards his sword. Before he could wrap his fingers around the hilt, he dropped to the ground with a choked, gurgling groan. I blinked, too apathetic to fully comprehend what had just happened. A figure, veiled in shadows, loomed still like a statue over the collapsed body by the entrance. Then it moved towards me. A silver beam of the moon, almost defeated by the sun, illuminated the figure's face. It was the bow. He halted a few steps away from me and placed his hands on his hips. He appeared to me like a docker who examined the payload that had to be carried from the ship to the wharf in hours of hard work. A smile appeared on his face, engaging, perceptive, and scornful. "You actually have it," he spoke in a pleasant baritone, fascinated. "What?" The bow laughed. "Well, what?" He paused and for a moment seemed to look right through me. Then his eyes met mine again, and I perceived in them a curious change I was unable to comprehend at that time. The Fire. Chapter 5. Kalian. The man before me towered over me by half a head. His physique was athletic but not heavy, his eyes pitch black and sparkling. Yet it was his smile which grabbed my attention. It was peculiar and crooked, and it made me believe there was nothing that could impress this man. It was neither naive like the smile of a child, nor was it cynical like that of an old man who had seen too much. It did not compare to anything I knew. There he was, and both of us looked absurd. Me, a thin, plain-looking man, kneeling over the dead body of a giant, my hands coated in blood, my face apathetic, the dagger lying forgotten by my feet. Him, tall, handsome, dressed in elegant clothes, arms crossed, almost relaxed, observing me curiously. Suddenly, I broke into loud laughter. I threw my head into my neck and simply laughed, loud and resounding. The laughter of a man who was so overwhelmed by the situation he found himself in that his mind left him no other choice. I tried to get up, away from the body, but slipped as my hands slid over the blood-soaked floor. I landed back on the corpse lengthways, feeling the still warm blood get sucked up by my clothes and spread in a damp spot across my chest. "You have not eaten up," it shot through my head. Bad JL. Instead of bringing me back to reality, the nonsensical thought fueled my laughter. I rolled on my back, clutched my stomach, and gasped for air. The man, whose name was unknown to me then, reacted in a similarly odd manner. First, he rubbed his chin with the thumb and index finger and furrowed his brow. He acted like a farmer whose sheep had started to bleat and jump around as if they had been bitten by the Black Guardian. Then he laughed as well. For me and my overwhelmed, confused mind, the situation became even more absurd. I could barely breathe as the laughter grew so strong that my lungs threatened to fail. Suddenly, while hot tears ran down my cheeks, I heard a thud. My sight faded to black, and I lost consciousness. I woke up with a metallic taste in my mouth. My eyelids felt heavy, glued shut, and my sight was blurred when I managed to open them. I found myself in a forest, under a small ledge of rock surrounded by dark pine trees. Outside the shelter, rain poured down. Only the fire, which burned about an arm's length away, kept me from feeling cold. I tried to turn my gaze so I could fully conceive my surroundings, but a biting pain exploded in the back of my head. I groaned and instinctively pressed my lips and eyelids together. "Good evening," a voice said nearby. Startled, I tried to look in the direction where the voice had come from, only to be punished by more severe pain. This time, a cry escaped my mouth. The voice responded with laughter. I heard someone stand up and approach. A pair of boots entered my field of vision. Then someone knelt before me. It was the beau. He wore his chin-long hair and a small bun on the top of his head, which would have given him the look of an Arizalian monk if it were not for the elegant clothing. "I'm sorry about the bump," he said with an apologetic smile. I must have exaggerated a little. I stared at him in confusion. My memories of the day before were pale and distant, slow to return. The tavern, the humiliation by the two brutes, my plan for revenge, the stable. The insight struck like lightning on an old tree in a clearing. I had killed him, butchered him. I pressed my hands to my mouth, shivering all over despite the warmth of the fire. Every detail of last night's events re-entered my conscious thought with the force of a dropped anvil. How the brute had caught me in the act and dashed me to the ground. The pain when he had kicked me over and over, the rise of blazing rage, the smacking sound of the dagger piercing his back, his bewildered face, his hoarse voice shakily begging for mercy. My frenzy, my satisfaction, my ecstasy growing stronger with every stab. Without any warning, I vomited on my clothes. I coughed and retched, tears rising in my eyes. "Slaughtered, you have slaughtered him." Again and again the words repeated in my mind. I was so consumed by my thoughts that I entirely forgot about the existence of the man in front of me. Finally, when the memories of the night caught up to me, and I remembered the moments when I had lost consciousness, I proceeded to stare at him in disbelief once more. He had not moved an inch, and was still kneeling in front of me. His lips smiled, but his black eyes were earnest, almost devout. Had he knocked me out? He must have, and had brought me here. But why? And as if he had read the question in my eyes, he shook his head and pointed at a small bag next to my sleeping place. I looked at him with uncertainty, and his smile widened into a grin. What is it? You look at me as if I was Delmaric's ghost. I felt my tension ease a bit. Still, I was unable to speak a word, whereupon the stranger pursed his lips. Have a look inside your bag, unless you don't mind decorating yourself with your own vomit. Hesitantly, I followed his suggestion and found a large cloth embroidered in blue and white. I shot another glance at him like a child who had received something it had never held in its hands before. His brows knitted together skeptically, and I realized that my behavior must seem odd to him. Does it really seem odd? After all, he was the one who had brought me here, and he knows what has happened. Grudgingly, I crossed my legs and began to wipe the remains of whisper tree resin I had consumed yesterday from my robe. The beau observed my movements attentively. When I was at least a little more presentable, he rose and turned towards the dancing flames. There was something cooking over the fire. Drink. The bile made my mouth feel unpleasantly bitter, and my throat was dry as the dunes of the powdered desert. Briefly, I felt the pang of hunger, but the memories of yesterday's events squashed it abruptly. The mysterious man ladled something from the kettle, and a faint breeze carried the scent of sugar mint and honey to my nose. He faced me again, a bruised cup in each hand. He gave me one and sat down on a tree stump. It's only that bad the first time. I flinched. Pardon me? Surely you understand me. For a moment his gaze went distance. Then he shook his head almost unnoticeably and refocused on me. But where are my manners? He knocked his fist against his chest, a military salute which seemed inappropriate to his person. I am Kalian. When I did not respond, he asked, And who are you? I was inclined to tell the man a false name, but decided against it. J.L. Tannerson. Kalian removed his glove, reached out to me, and I shook his hand. His grip was warm and firm. So, J.L., very pleased to meet you. He smiled and looked straight into my eyes without blinking. An awe of veneration ran down my spine. What a presence! I remembered the woman who had sat next to him the other day in the tavern. Now I understood why she had looked at him with such devotion. Uneasily, I lowered my head. I envied Kalian's appearance, his demeanor, and his endearing manners. Despite the thousands of questions whirling in my head, I could not help but like the stranger. I was certainly not the first one to have this experience. He radiated a kind of boldness that seemed powerful enough to tempt fate itself. Kalian withdrew his hand and took a sip of tea. Well, where do we start? I blinked helplessly. Start with what? The questions, of course. Don't tell me you don't have questions. He studied me. Or maybe I should start. Where do you come from, JL? You do not look like a man of the world. I come from a small village, I replied carefully. When Kalian only raised an eyebrow, I added, Fogville. Fogville, not a very exciting place. Now I was the one to raise my brow. You know Fogville? Kalian made a dismissive gesture. I stopped there once on a mission. You have a cozy tavern. Again that smile, and a few beautiful women. Yes, of course. What in the name of Malthus does this guy want from me? Yesterday he had caught me in the act, he knows, and now we're verbally sparring like two hunters who had met in a tavern over a mug of mead. I decided to make a foray, not out of courage or bravery, but because I could not bear the weight of the unspoken words anymore. Listen, Kalian. I felt a lump form in my throat and quickly drank some tea. It was so hot that I wondered how he had been able to drink without burning his mouth. How did I get here? Another smile, lenient this time. I brought you here. He seemed to notice the irritated look on my face and added, After I struck you down. Let's say you had difficulty coping with the situation. After a moment of silence, I took care of the bodies. Bodies? The word jolted me, and again I felt bile rising up at the back of my throat. This time, however, I was able to suppress the urge to vomit and was only left with a terrible taste on my tongue. I covered my cough with a fist and shot an uncertain look at Kalian. He talks as if all of this is perfectly normal. But it was not, damn it. I had committed a crime, and even worse than the crime itself was the manner in which I had committed it. I am a monster, a god-forsaken monster. As if he had read my mind, Kalian leaned forward. I know what you must think now, JL. You feel guilty, don't you? You feel like a monster, or some such thing? I shifted in place as I did my best to maintain eye contact, but ultimately could not withstand the intensity of those black embers. I turned my gaze away. Kalian seemed to interpret that as agreement. Forget about that nonsense. What you did was the right thing. A sad laugh escaped my throat. The right thing? Yes, but wait. He rubbed his chin with his thumb and index finger and stared into the fire. Let me tell you a story, then you will understand. I nodded superfluously, for he had already started to narrate. Once there was a family, 5 people, a woman, her 2 husbands, and 2 children. He noticed the wrinkle appearing in my forehead. They came from Kira, for in Kira they live differently, you know. There are not only couples, but also people living in larger families, called circles. Anyway, he paused to bring the mug to his lips. This family was not a lucky one. One of the husbands, called Kashan, had just lost his job on a sugarcane plantation outside Al-Kashim, the capital. The wife, who worked as a weavess for a wealthy merchant, also lost her job when her employer was befallen by financial troubles. All in all, the situation in Al-Kashim was troublesome. The streets were dangerous, the flesh maggot plague was wreaking havoc under the population, and it was a bad time for people who lived in a circle with 2 children, and who had no pennyholes in their pockets, so they decided to find happiness elsewhere. His eyes wandered, staring past me, towards a new world, a new life, and so, he turned toward me again. They spent their very last pennies on a journey to Enderal. However, when they arrived in Ark, they realized that life here was not all as they had imagined. Even in the foreign quarter, prices were too high for them to afford, and none of them, except for one of the husbands, spoke Enderalian. Therefore, they had no choice but to move into the Undercity. I thought I saw melancholy lurk in his dark eyes. Do you know the Undercity, JL? Yes, I've heard of it. He gave a nod. Well, so you know that it is not a friendly place for families. The streets are dangerous, even more so than they were back in Al-Rashim. Blackmail and murder are commonplace. It is a slum, and the most ironic thing about it is the fact that the cavern in which it was erected lies directly underneath the nobles' quarter of Ark, where sublimes hold masquerade balls and philosophize about morals and ethics. With the last part of that sentence, rage flashed across Kalian's handsome features. The black coals of his eyes smoldered. It stayed there for a heartbeat, maybe 2, before disappearing as fast as it had arrived. Anyway, the small family moved into one of the shabby, box-shaped homes in an alley called Canal Street. The street lived up to its name, stinking, dark and narrow. Although it was definitely not the new beginning the Circle had envisioned, the 3 parents did not become discouraged. They had known there would be obstacles and were determined to overcome them. Aside from that, their faith in Orlando strengthened them. In their tiny house, which consisted of a single room divided into separate spaces by cloths, they had erected a humble shrine. Every evening, they prayed to their goddess and drew courage and strength from it. Indeed, things seemed to get better when Keshan was hired on a farm outside the city walls. Now, you might not understand how peculiar this was, but let me tell you that it is more likely that a Vatir learns to read and write than someone from the Undercity, and to make matters worse, someone with dark skin, finds decent and honest work with a farmer in the heartland. Kashan was aware of this, and he and his circle had learned that there were people who hated them because of their origin alone. And these were not merely people from the upper city. Even their neighbors shouted shagarounds or coal people at them on the streets. For the world is like this, my friend. People are afraid of what they do not know. Families with multiple parents, a Turner, people with black skin, all foreign things are dangerous to them. Yet Kashan remained determined. Every morning he got up long before the first cockcrow and walked the arduous way to the farm where he worked. He returned long after the sun had set. Work was hard, but he was grateful for the opportunity to give his family, especially his 2 children, a better life. Kalian picked up a piece of firewood and threw it into the fire. But things turned out differently, of course, for among the noble people who live in Ark, there is a faction. It calls itself the Citadel and proclaims to be a bastion of traditional values, as they put it. At some point, they got wind of the coal man who took away a hard-working, honest Enderalian's job on a farm. The Citadel's members knew what they had to do. One night, when Kashan returned to his shed in Canal Street, he sensed that something was wrong. He was unable to put his finger on it, just sensed it like a mother could feel that something had befallen her son. What exactly had happened, he discovered upon entering his home. Everyone was dead. Both of his children, Lilia and Garal, his husband, Jashek, and his wife, Zamira. His children he found in a corner, crouched together and wrapped in a bloody cloth. They had cut Lilia's throat and Garal's thigh artery. Jashek appeared to have fought back, as he had several stab wounds in the chest, in addition to having been beheaded. Zamira lay flat on the table, and the blood between her legs was clear evidence of what had been done to her before she had been killed. Just as Kashan wanted to cry, he felt a burning pain in his back and fell to the ground, dead. Kalian had narrated the last part of his story without blinking. Stunned and speechless, I gawked at him. Tell me, JL, what do you think about my story? Do you like it? Is it true? I asked, for want of a better reply. Yes, it is true. I searched Kalian's face for a hint of what to say, but found none. What in blazes does he expect from me? That's terrible. Kalian nodded. Exactly. And what would you say if I told you that the 2 men we killed yesterday were members of the Citadel? Pardon me? The 2 apes who now lie dead at the bottom of the pond? I did not notice that he used the exact same word for them as I had in my thoughts. They were members of the Citadel, and they murdered the family of the Kyranian. All for the greater good, of course. Again, cold rage flickered in his eyes. I do not understand, I replied, even though I did. Kalian's eyes narrowed to slits. Oh yes, you do. Salbor and Andreu Mithal. They are sons of a wealthy ruler from Enderal's north, and they are murderers. For a short, irrational moment, I was flooded with triumph. They had deserved to die. The corners of my mouth twitched, but then the terrible memories of the knife and pain and ecstasy returned. Memories of the joy I had felt when I stabbed the man, butchered him, the blood. But I was not aware of it, even if I stopped mid-sentence and cast my eyes to the ground. How could I in any way describe what I felt? For a while there was silence between us. Just when I looked up, refinding my courage to ask a question, Kalian did something unexpected. Before I knew what was happening, he was right in front of me, leaving only 2 hands' width between our faces. I would have flinched, but something in the man's gaze paralyzed me. I was unable to move, stiff as a wax figure. Initially, the change in him failed to register, but then I saw it. His eyes were blazing. My first thought that it was a reflection of the campfire. When I realized that the fire burned behind Kalian, I knew that his eyes had indeed changed color. They were like glowing coals, like a candle wick just before it was completely consumed by fire. His features had shed the joviality they had worn for the past 30 minutes. Then he began to speak, quietly, but sound and clear. The tone of his voice sent shivers down my spine. The scum deserved to die, JL. They were corrupted. He made no attempt to explain the last word. I was in the Red Ox because I was chosen to murder them. You had beaten me to it, and you have done me and the world a favor. I did not know where I found the strength to answer, but I did, even though my words were only a whisper, like a deathbed confession. But I savored it. Disgust and self-loathing welled up in me once again. A dull fear, the burden of a man who was well aware he had done something terrible. My shoulders slumped, and I lowered my head as if it was Malthus, and not Kalian, to whom I had just confessed the ecstasy during the murder. But Kalian did not allow me to get overwhelmed. He put his right hand on my shoulder, and with his left hand, turned my face so I had to look directly at him. I know, JL. Do you know why? He did not give me any time to reply. For you have felt what they had done. You have felt their crimes and their guilt, and the ecstasy was the reward for your courage. It was the nectar of their sins. I exhaled slowly, and from one moment to the next, it was over. The glow in Kalian's eyes was gone. He sat back on the stump and was looking at his face. I was left to wonder if my mind had not played a trick on me. After a couple of minutes, I finally asked the crucial question, without even knowing what I really wanted to ask. Why? But Kalian understood. Because you are special, and because the blood that runs in your veins is the same as mine, and as that of our brothers and sisters. I stared at him, baffled. For what had to be the dozenth time that day, my mental capacity was depleted, and I could not process yet another revelation of such weight. Brothers and sisters? I could not go any longer. My eyelids were leaden, my limbs faint and weak. Kalian seemed to notice. There is a long journey ahead of us. I will explain everything you need to know, but now go to sleep." The glimmer I had seen in his eyes before made a subtle return. Dusk is nearing. The following morning, the both of us, as different as day and night, headed towards Ark, the legendary capital. He was well dressed, handsome, and always confidently smiling. I was dressed in worn clothes, had a hooked nose, and the puzzled look of a man who had no idea what was happening to him. The first 2 days of our journey were terrible. I barely ate, and I frequently thought I could see blood on my hands or hear human death cries among the singing of the birds. Even the silence did not calm me. Please, no. You might ask yourself why I followed the strange man, and I cannot give you a clear answer to that question. Surely many things would have turned out differently if I had slipped away in the grey mist of the morning, but my exhaustion did not allow me to leave. I probably would not have left anyway, since Killian's word had a hypnotic effect on me, which I was unable to explain to myself. It was the nectar of their sins. 1,000 questions haunted me. Nevertheless, the knowledge that the murder I had committed was a good and righteous deed served as a straw for my plagued mind to cling to. It was a peculiar feeling to have killed a man. Young soldiers and guardsmen have colourful dreams about honour and glory. When they fantasize about thrusting a sword into a pathless man's chest, they believe it to be a wondrous feeling. Even though the experience had been exactly that for me, the aftermath was not. My state shifted between an emotionless paralysis and lightning-fast epiphanies, which had filled me with guilt and disgust, and overcame me with the force of an autumnal floods on the coast of Maya. In these moments, one wonders if killing can be justified at all. The more often you perform the act of killing, however, the fewer doubts you have. The coldness grows until the taking of a life becomes trivial. Back then, though, this way of thinking was unfamiliar to me. When on the first evening, Killian offered me a bowl of hot, steaming oatmeal and a blood-red wild berries in the light of the setting sun, my stomach recoiled even before I had eaten a spoonful. Did I notice a hint of guilty conscience in Killian's eyes, or was it amusement? I did not know. While we packed our belongings, I asked him about the meaning of yesterday's statement once more. He only shook his head and told me that the meaning of the fire could not be taught by conversation alone, just as swimming could not be learned by reading treatises about the consistency of water. On the third day, things started to get better, and for the first time since I had met Killian, I did not feel the weakening nausea every time I halted and allowed my thoughts to wander. Of course, my state of mind was far from joyful, but in an odd way, I felt better than directly after my departure from Fogville. There was a simple reason for this. The fear was gone from my stomach. Or in better words, I felt as if I had appeased it, like a wild animal that had just had a good meal, knowing there was more to come. I am on the right path. How strange these words sounded in my mouth. So strange yet reassuring, as if I had glimpsed a light on the horizon, a light I should have been following all my life. My sense of guilt was starting to diminish as well. Even though there was no way for me to verify Killian's story, I knew he must have told the truth. The arrogant faces, the vile voices, these two men had been evil, corrupted. More victims would have followed after Kashan's family. The more I thought on this, the stronger my conviction became. Killing them had been killing them had been right, moral. While we were on the road, Killian told me a lot of other things, a great deal of them stories from his past. I learned that he hailed from Nerim, which explained his subtle accent. He had grown up in Kabait, the capital of the North Realm, just as the Middle Realm. It fell under the rule of Chancellor Baratheon, but Killian believed that a civil war between the Northern Separatists and the Chancellor was imminent within the next 10 years. His migration to Enderal had many reasons, and with a rejecting, albeit not harsh, look, he indicated that I was not yet ready to know these chapters from his past. After a week's march, we arrived in Ark. I do not wish to waste ink with descriptions. I am certain the capital of Enderal is well known to you, and you might imagine how overwhelmed I was by its sight. We first saw it from a small mountain ledge, and I spent minutes watching the city bathing in the light of the setting sun. Impressive, isn't it? Killian remarked. I murmured something without turning my gaze. He let out a laugh. Indulge. Sometimes the first time is the best time, he said, and sat down on the edge of the cliff, a chasm of about 400 arms lengths deep. I watched him close his eyes and let the evening sun warm his face. Again, I felt envy's sting. If a young woman had come up the hill, she would have considered him to be the hero of a bard's song. But at the same time, I knew that Kalian was not showing off. He was simply enjoying the moment and the sunlight, an ability I had not developed in my life. It was already dark by the time we arrived at the gates and showed our papers to the city guards to request entrance. We pretended to be merchants from Araziel who had been forced to dock in the harbour of Duneville due to unfavourable weather. After examining the papers quickly, the guardswoman allowed us into the city. When the heavy gates shut behind us and the portcullis descended with a loud rattle, any lingering thoughts I might still have had about returning to my old life as a priest vanished. Our first stop was a tavern called the Dancing Nomad. Kalian opened his bulging purse and invited me to a stew of sugar beets, crunchy Enderalian bread, and a very expensive beer from Cabate. We did not talk much. Instead, we listened to the music of a beautiful red-haired bard, whose dark voice was in stark contrast to her fragile physique. She sang traditional tunes such as the Song of the Aged Man, the Wayward Wanderer, or the Maid in the Silver Glow. I averted my eyes and feigned great interest in my cleared plate when Kalian joined in with the last song in full voice. Only when I noticed that people did not object to his good, but not brilliant singing, but began to sing along as well, my unfounded shame faded and I became increasingly comfortable. We stayed in the tap room until late. When only 5 other guests were left, I dared ask the question which had been burning on my lips. What now? Kalian's gaze met mine, and he did not lower it until I directed mine towards the ground. Despite having spent a week in his company, his demeanour could still make me uneasy. I heard a sound which could have been muffled, laughter as well as a sigh, and I chanced to glance back up. Now we are going to sleep like logs, and tomorrow, his eyes sparkled for a moment, the first lesson awaits you. I had no idea what his words meant. The first lesson? He smiled. Chapter 6. The Silver Cloud. One of Kalian's skills that I never learned to understand was to get by with almost no sleep. During our journey, he went to bed well past midnight, and he always managed to be awake before me, often long before dusk. He had a strict morning routine. It started with half an hour of prayer in a language I did not recognize. Then he practiced with his scimitar for a good hour, a little longer than that for 2 days of the week. After that, he took a bath, or when there was no river or lake nearby, sprinkled some water on himself. Finally, he prepared a breakfast of cereal pulp mixed with bitter herbs, which he meditatively devoured as if all mysteries of the Pyreans were contained within. I guessed that he only slept a maximum of 4 hours per night, and I wondered how he managed to look as healthy and energetic as after a bath in the waters of Inadon. On our journey, he had let me sleep, but on our first day in Ark, he woke me up early in the morning. My limbs felt leaden after the night of carousing, my head considerably worse. Initially, my sleepy gaze roamed the room in search of the water trough I had used to wash myself every morning in Fogville. Then I realized where I was. I groaned, hauled myself out of bed with some difficulty, and peered through the window. By the righteous path, what time is it? There was no sign of the sun yet. As if he had read my thoughts, Kalian answered my question. 2 more hours before the cocks crow, my friend. Before you say anything, he was just about to strap his sword to his waist. It is necessary. We have an appointment. I wanted to answer, but only a sullen murmur left my mouth. Kalian continued, Meet me in an hour in front of the last house in Cloud Alley. I will wait for you there. He left the room before I was able to reply. Baffled, I remained in my spot by the window. While I tried to become just a little bit more awake, I looked over the roofs of the sleeping city. There were no clouds in sight to hide the silver light of the moon, and despite the early hour, several people were making their way through the streets already. The headache I suffered as a result of inebriation and the ungodly early hour, notwithstanding, I felt quite well. The rawness of the events in the Red Ox had begun to fade over the past few days, but now Kalian's words were on the forefront of my mind again. You have felt their crimes and their guilt, and the ecstasy was the reward for your courage. It was the nectar of their sins. Could this be the reason why the murder left me cold? Because it had been justified? I thought, please no. I thought, something good. A strange, indiscernible noise escaped me, which could somehow be interpreted as cheery or despairing. I shook away the conflicting thoughts and studied the activity below instead. I saw 3 emaciated children carry heavy sacks along the broad street which ran through Ark. Directly behind them, 3 armoured figures, most likely guards, were on patrol. 2 women, one of them tall and muscular, the other one slim, pushed a wheelbarrow with a barrel and 3 bundles of hay stacked on top of it into the alley which led to the rear exit of the tavern. Eventually, I turned away from the window and got dressed. After I had eaten a meal in the tap room, I started on my way, feeling a mixture of curiosity and anxiousness. I do not want to bore you with the unnecessary details of my first journey through Ark, for you probably know where the shriek Kalian mentioned is situated. I did not know then. Only after a guard eyed me suspiciously and pointed me towards a half-decayed warehouse did I realize where I was, and that I had arrived 15 minutes before the appointed time. Cloud Alley, as the builders of the city had named it without any apparent reason, marked the end of the South Quarter. It was the path to the large stone gate which every decent upper town citizen hoped to never enter. It marked the entry to the Undercity. I looked around insecurely. I knew about the Undercity from countless stories, including Kalian's. It was a place to be avoided unless one was dealing with concealers or criminals, or living in such poverty that one of the rundown shacks down there was the only affordable home. Regardless of how I had pictured the contrast between the beautiful capital and the misery of the Undercity, my mental images always included a transition of sorts between prosperity and poverty, but there appeared to be no such thing. Looking up, I could see the impressive Myrad Tower, where wealthy travellers arrived in the city or departed to other places on the backs of their eponymous winged animals. On my left, a large waterfall came pouring down from the mountain upon which Ark had been built, and if I had walked back through the alley via which I had left the sprawling marketplace a few minutes ago, I would have found myself in the heart of the foreign quarter. I looked back at the wooden door again, as if its mundane, unobscured presence offended me. 2 heavily armed men were positioned on each side, a sign that the inconspicuous door did conceal something of import. Was this really the entrance to that other unpleasant world? I felt a hand on my shoulder. Kalian. You found it. Very good, he said. Are you ready? I screwed up my eyes. I now know that my first lesson had to do with the Undercity, but what exactly was awaiting me? I think so, and what are we going to do? Kalian chuckled. Quite simple, my friend. He let the knapsack slide down his shoulder and went down to his knees and rummaged through the contents. Once he found what he had been searching for, he looked up at me again. We are going to have fun. The faint hope that the large guarded wooden door was not in fact the gate to the Undercity vanished mere seconds after the guards had allowed us through. They must think that we are crazy. I thought as both wings of the door swung open. No upper town citizen went here voluntarily, for it was well known that the Order and the Guard were virtually powerless down below. Unofficially, everyone knew about the silent agreement between the Order and the Relata, the association of shady characters who ruled this part of Ark, where sunlight could not reach. You stay among yourselves, and we stay among ourselves. Therefore, the Undercity was practically a town within beneath the town, and it was much gloomier than the Ark above ground, with its rustic, cozy, half-timbered houses, fountains, and theatres. Down here, the Relata controlled every aspect of life, and whoever was unfortunate enough to have to call the caverns home, whether they wanted or not, had to bow to them. Shuddering, I remembered what a travelling merchant had once told me. His story revolved around a young tradesman who only a few moons before had received the coveted badge of the Golden Sickle, which denoted him as a sound businessman. This young man wanted to take the quick route to wealth, and with the help of a few lads from Ark, he started to collect glimmercap dust. Its production was more or less an unofficial privilege of the Relata, yet this fact did not deter the young man from sending the group of unsuspecting boys to a cave near the west coast to begin his own, unobtrusive, as he believed, trade in the deadly narcotic. For almost a moon's turn, business went well, and his purse was filled faster than the mugs of a popular tavern. One morning, however, when he rode to the grotto where the mushrooms were collected, he found it deserted. There was only a cart with 4 man-sized baskets in front of the entrance. The baskets were filled to the edge with glimmercap mushrooms, but they emitted a strange odour. When the merchant told his bodyguard to shovel the content out on the ground, different body parts rolled out of each of the baskets. Arms, legs, torsi, heads. The heads had been cut off carefully so there could be no doubt about their owners. 5 of them belonged to the unfortunate boys who had been hired by the merchant for a modest earning. 2 of the heads belonged to the merchant's daughters. The 8th one was his companion's head. 2 words had been carved on her forehead: Sharim Relata. The Relata does not forget. They let the merchant live. He was never again seen in the Golden Sickle Guildhouse, and rumour has it that he took his own life a few months later. Thus ended the old travelling merchant's story. And now we are here. I felt uneasy. Everything about us screamed Upper Town and wealth. Our gestures, our clothes, Kalian's dagger. Behind the entrance, stairs led down into the darkness. It took us more than 15 minutes before we encountered signs of human life. The air was cold and humid. It smelled of ammonia, mould, and damp stone. The long stone stairway transitioned into a ramp of wooden planks, which led even deeper down into a tunnel of about 30 arms lengths high. The first hut we passed had been constructed to fit so tightly into a natural corner of the rocks that I barely noticed it. Mighty rusty ducks stuck out of the wall and disappeared into the floor, winding around the brittle wood the house was made of. Chests and barrels, some of them broken, were piled up the walls which were not bordered by the stone of the cavern. As we ventured deeper into the underground system, more and more inhabitants took notice of our presence. Some of them regarded us with suspicion and swiftly averted their gaze. Others stared openly at us with barely concealed hostility. We passed more barracks and even saw constructions with roof overhangings in front of them, just like market stalls on the surface. Fish, spices, unhealthy-looking bread, and other wares lay on display under them. Their early vendors watching everyone in their vicinity with alert eyes. Kalian did not seem to mind the people's gaze. He accelerated his step and disappeared around a corner. I followed him, and what I saw took my breath away. Before me was a vast cavern with a ceiling so high that 2 guard towers stacked on top of each other could have fit inside. Stalactites hung from the ceiling like icicles of stone. In the distance, an impressive waterfall flowed down from the crag. Throughout the cavern, houses of dark wood were erected on platforms connected by stairs and bridges, supported by piers and natural stone pillars. The houses became increasingly tall towards the walls of the cave, making the cavern reminiscent of a gigantic amphitheatre. In the centre, buildings had been erected on the bare stone floor. They differed in form and appearance from the houses on platforms. I saw a stone building that, with its high roof and pointy tower, looked like a small temple. Next to it, a dozen arms lengths away, stood a multi-story building. It was made of stone as well, and its windows emitted a dull reddish glow. Numerous people were bustling about, and even though I had a good view of the round, open space that was most likely the centre of the subterranean city, it was so dark that I could barely make out their silhouettes. The Undercity, a name well deserved. A beefy man passed by and bumped into me, rousing me from my thoughts. I sighed and wiped the sweat from my forehead, which had accumulated despite the cold air. Then I looked for Kalian, who had already walked ahead. I found him at the foot of a stairway beneath a leafless, crooked tree. He was talking to someone. Hastily, I went down the stairs. As I neared them, the stranger pointed towards me, and Kalian made a placating gesture. Only when I got close, I realized that it was a woman. Her hair was short and blonde, a stark contrast to her soft face with full red lips. Her eyes, however, I felt something glow in my stomach, protesting, angry. Her eyes were a chilling ice blue, so lurid that they seemed to shine even in the faint light of the cavern. Although I dare say they were objectively beautiful, they aroused a feeling in me which I was unable to put into words. They appeared cold. Before I was able to consider the voice that sounded inside me again, Kalian had addressed me. JL, may I introduce you? He pointed at the young woman with his open hand, palm directed upwards. This is Yelena. I tried to respond, but failed. Yelena examined me briefly from head to toe, then turned her gaze away from me. He looks close to pissing his pants. Are you absolutely sure? It's not too late yet. Kalian smiled charmingly and nodded. I am, and you can trust him. You have my word. The woman bit her lip and furrowed her brows, but ultimately returned Kalian's nod. Very well, let's go. We started walking. Maybe it was only my imagination, but I had the impression The number of hateful looks around us had increased. The air and darkness in the cavern suddenly felt even more oppressive. Killian glanced at me over his shoulder. There was no trace of fear or uneasiness in his eyes. On the contrary, they appeared to gleam with anticipation. But why? I was all too aware of the fact that there are many shifty people around here. Why then did Killian and our guide seem to be so familiar with each other? Our destination was a dark alley directly next to the multi-story house with the red windows. A sign at the entrance identified it as the Silver Cloud. Determined, the woman stepped into the dark. We followed her. There was absolute darkness in the shadows of the buildings, and my uneasiness grew when I saw that our guide, at the end of the alley, headed into an even narrower one. This is a labyrinth, and a damn dangerous one. I saw no people around here, only heaps of rubbish and puddles of feces. The stench made me retch, and for a while most of my energy was devoted to suppressing the urge to vomit. How Kalian could remain so unfazed in an awful, disgusting place as this could be added to the list of mysteries about him I had yet to figure out. Twice we encountered others in this dark, subterranean maze. The first time we ran into two men warming themselves at a campfire. As Yelena saw the fire from afar, she sped up her gait and kicked one of the men against the head with a full force. He let out a choked cry and fell down, while his companion, terrified, tried to raise himself up against the wall. Yelena did not allow him to. She leaned toward him, holding her face close to the beggars, and murmured something about open fire, Ali, and the siblings. Then she dashed him to the ground and told us to move on. Our second encounter with human beings was a figure draped in sheets, leaning against the wall of a house. I almost did not take her for a person because of her veiling. As I passed, however, she dug into my thigh with bony fingers. I uttered a cry and spun around. She removed the cloth which concealed her head, revealing a face hardly older than my own, but covered in festering, pulsating ulcers. Flesh maggots. She whispered something which sounded like a craving plea, but only a guttural rattling noise left her mouth. Jerkily, I broke my leg free from her claw and hurried after Kalian and Yelena. When we finally arrived, after what felt like an eternity, I was exhausted, as if I had been wandering briskly for a full day. I feared I would never get rid of the disgusting odor that stuck to me. Yelena halted by a thick steel door and knocked twice. A few moments later, a hatch opened, and two eyes peeked outside from under bushy brows. Once they recognized our leader, I heard the noise of a creaky latch, and the door opened. The door guard was an unremarkable man with his hair cropped short, and he reminded me of myself in an unpleasant manner. He looked at us appraisingly, but his gestures indicated that he was Yelena's subordinate. With relief, I noticed that the building, unlike what I had expected based on its exterior, was clean and lit by several candlesticks and candelabras on the walls. There was even a slight scent of lavender in the air, which, after the omnipresent odor of feces I had had to endure for the last hours, seemed like the divine smell of Holanda's hair to me. Without any conversation, Kalian and I were guided along a narrow corridor with numerous closed doors. Despite the dim light shining from underneath them, they struck me as oppressive, like cell doors. At the end of the corridor, Yelena opened another door. The room we entered was impressive. It was decorated with finely crafted furniture and pillows, and a chandelier emitted soft orange light from the center. There was a haze in the air, and as I looked around the low tables surrounded by hassocks, I realized where the scent of lavender came from. Altogether, there were seats for about 24 people, but except for us, the door guard, and Yelena, only 3 other guests sat separately at the tables, drinking wine and smoking water pipes. Soothing harp music played in the corner of the room that was hidden from view. I was beginning to feel more at ease again. Maybe this was indeed simply a smoker's tavern? Perhaps an exclusive place for even more exclusive customers? Why the exclusive customers should take the troublesome journey through the alleys just to smoke a few pipes of peaceweed with lavender scent, I could not say. I pursed my lips and shot a helpless look at Kalian. He only smiled contentedly and gave a slight nod in my direction, which was probably supposed to be reassuring. "Have a seat," Yelena said, and she pointed at an empty table in a corner. Then she silently disappeared behind a curtain, and the door guard returned to the entrance. I wanted to say something, but Kalian indicated me to wait. We sat down. Furtively, I looked around and mustered the other guests. 2 men, one of them young, the other one old, and an elderly woman who wore her hair in a bun. Judging by their clothes, they were all wealthy, like ourselves. None of them took notice of us. Kalian took out one of the candles on our tables and held it under the pot of the water pipe before he leaned back. Our pillows lay next to a wall and yawned cheerfully. He observed the water pipe with a merry, relaxed gaze. In the pot, bubbles slowly began to emerge. For a while, I did the same as him. Then I decided to break the silence. Kalian, he cut off my words with a gesture and shook his head, almost leniently. Just relax, my friend. With one hand, he touched the pot of the water pipe. Relax. We waited more than 30 minutes before a chubby man with a friendly smile approached us. He introduced himself as Conthis. The first thing I noticed was that the left sleeve of his expensive-looking burgundy garment hung limply down. He was one-armed. As he held out his right hand in greeting, I spotted several shimmering rings on his meaty fingers. A surprisingly pleasant smell reached my nose, originating from his perfume. It was spicy and sweet. Please excuse the delay. He started the conversation with a dark, bassy voice, which did not match his appearance. We have many customers today. May I have a seat? Kalian answered in the affirmative to the pleasantry, and Conthis sat down opposite to us. For a long moment, none of us said anything, and I felt how Conthis's dark, perceptive eyes mustered me. Eventually, he nodded. Well then, formalities first. He removed a folded piece of parchment from his garment, opened it, and studied it briefly. Jaraman Bethila, 46 winters. Old, merchant, and... Ah, you come from Eraziel. Gosh, may I say that your Enderal is very good. His question seemed to refer to Kalian. He smiled. Skill comes with practice, I guess. Indeed it does, and then there is... Jael Thalus, Arazalian as well. I inclined my head and attempted to smile as charmingly as Kalian. Very well. Conthis folded the parchment back up and leaned forward a little. Then we begin. Agreed? Kalian blew smoke upwards from the corner of his mouth. Like all consumers of peaceweed, he had slightly misty eyes, but he nevertheless appeared to have a clear mind. Please, he replied. For completeness, let me once again explain the rules of the procedure of your visit, which will hopefully not be your last. His voice was friendly, but I could sense a certain sharpness in it. As soon as you have paid the rest, a servant will... We have to pay before we receive the service? Kalian looked indignant. Thus are the rules, Matris. I am sorry. Conthis replied without lowering his eyes. Kalian looked sourly at the burly man, but still made an affirmative gesture. Conthis' mouth curved in a smile. Well now, a servant will give you a sign and accompany you to your chambers. He looked at the parchment again. Or rather, your chamber. The girls will be waiting there. Whatever happens next will be up to you. The girls? A shudder went down my spine, and I gave Kalian a nervous glance. Conthis had noticed my gaze. Are you well, Matris? He inquired. Before I could answer, Kalian spoke. He is just a little excited. He shot me a reproving look. It is his first time. Conthis frowned. Well, I understand. As soon as you are done, ring the bell on the nightstand. Wait a few moments, then ring again, and someone will take care of... He appeared to struggle for a word. The rest, and that would be it. His shrewd eyes slid between Kalian and me. Are there any more questions from your side? Kalian had a question. I assume we will leave this place the same way we came in? Yes, Yelena will accompany you outside. I see, and you can guarantee our anonymity? My comrade muttered. Conthis gave a short laugh. We can guarantee that nobody except our attendants will have seen you arrive and leave this place, and you can be certain that our other guests have no interest in talking about your presence. I think I do not need to explain why. Kalian shortly rubbed his chin with his thumb and index finger, seemingly contemplating. After a couple of seconds, he nodded and held out his strong hand to Conthis. Accepted. We have a deal. Conthis smiled, pleased. First he shook Kalian's hand, then mine. His handshake was strong and firm. Afterwards, Kalian took a small bulging purse from his coat and emptied it on the table. 15 gold coins. You can count if you like. My eyes widened. 15 gold coins. What a fortune. 1 gold coin was worth 1,000 pennies. 1,000 pennies, enough to buy a decent house or a war horse of the finest breed. My head spun as I thought of the things I could purchase for a sum 15 times higher than that. Yet Kalian maintained an impassive expression in the face of all that shimmering gold. Did these riches come from the treasuries of his mysterious brothers and sisters? They probably did. I uneasily averted my gaze from the coins and observed our host, who was looking at them contentedly. "It will not be necessary." He waved his hand, and a lanky boy wearing a red garment stepped forward from behind 2 curtains. His head was bowed in humility. Once he reached our table, Conthis only pointed towards the coins. The lad collected them swiftly and silently and carried them away. After he had disappeared through the curtains, Conthis said, "Well then, indulge yourselves." Kalian smiled and blew out a cloud of smoke. "Thank you." Without further words, Conthis stood and left. After only 5 minutes, the curtains opened again, and the slim boy beckoned us to follow him. Kalian nodded curtly and took a last draw on the pipe. I noticed with unease that he had almost smoked 2 full pots of peaceweed, an amount that could put a cocky, inexperienced bachelor into a comatose slumber for several hours. Kalian, however, did not appear to be tired. His eyes had a milky shimmer characteristic of peaceweed consumers, and all his movements were calm, but I also spotted the strange, intimidating glimmer in his eyes I had seen on that evening when he told me about the nectar of sins. We rose and walked through the room towards the boy. Even when we stood directly in front of him, he did not look up, and kept his head lower. He turned around, and we followed him to a long corridor which opened behind the curtains. Similar to the hallway which led from the entrance area to the parlor, every 8 arms' lengths there were heavy steel doors on both sides. Each door had a number above its arch, written on a wickedly expensive-looking golden badge. We stopped in front of the door with number 16. Silently, the boy removed a heavy key from a large ring and thrust it into Kalian's hand. Then he bowed shortly, turned on his heel, and left. Kalian played with the key like a prestidigitator before inserting it into the lock. The door opened without a sound. The room was spacious and luxurious. A chandelier emitted candlelight which was tinted by a red paper screen. The air was heavily scented with roses and lavender. Even before I noticed the 2 blonde girls, a cold shudder travelled down my spine. When I entered the room behind Kalian and the heavy door snapped shut, before Kalian could inform me about the services this place provided, the pieces came together and formed a coherent, terrible whole. I looked around, overwhelmed. My gaze jumped between the various unambiguous elements of room 16. A pompous canopy bed stood in the center, 2 bound girls on top of it, stark naked, their eyes undoubtedly clouded by a narcotic. The box on a small table containing angular kernels, which I instantly identified as those of holly berries. Even a baker woman from old Lower Aranath knew of their aphrodisiac effect. Finally, the utensils hanging on the wall. "Do you like it?" Kalian asked. He had sat down on a sprawling arrangement of burgundy hassocks. He was barely an arm's length away from the bound girls on the bed, yet he did not look at them at all. In the corners of his mouth, I still saw the smile which never seemed to cease. "We are going to have some fun." "Monster," I thought, bewildered. Without a word, I attacked Kalian. With a loud cry, I jumped forward, launched myself on top of the man, and began to strangle him. Kalian seemed not to have expected it, and for a moment I thought I had the upper hand. Then, however, he started to laugh, or tried to. The result was a choking rattle. Full of rage, I increased the pressure while my face twisted into a hateful grimace. But Kalian just kept on laughing. His eyes were gleaming with joy and amusement. If I had watched the scene without being part of it myself, I probably would have considered it a fake, an exhibition fight. He made no effort to free himself from my grasp. "You miserable bastard, you damned piece of dirt." I pressed harder. I felt the stubbles of Kalian's beard pricking my fingers while I squeezed his warm flesh. Yet nothing happened. Kalian still laughed, and only after 60 seconds did it dawn on me that any normal human being should have been unconscious by now. Yet that did not happen. Nothing happened at all. Eventually, Kalian's laughter subsided, but not because I had killed him. His face, which had not even turned red, began to show the expression of blissful serenity again. Suddenly, I felt helpless and ridiculous. I had never seen Killian fight, but since the day we had met, I had felt the aura of power which surrounded him, like a veil of heat surrounding an open fire. He was dangerous. I took fright. He could kill me, shot through my head. Once, twice, again and again, like a gloomy drum roll. He could kill me. But I won't, Killian said. His lips did not move a bit. Then he placed his right hand on my chest, and 1 second later I was thrown back as if a cannonball had hit me. I slammed hard against the stone floor and lost consciousness. Chapter 7. All the Dead Souls. I do not know how long I had been absent from the world of the living, yet judging by the fact that Killian's neck still displayed imprints of my fingertips, it could have been only a few minutes at most. The first thing that went through my mind when I saw him kneeling over me was that my pathetic life was over. The second thing was that Killian, who by some unholy magic had had enough breath for laughter, even after being strangled for a full minute, could have let me die 1,000 deaths already. Yet he had not. Instead, he crouched and extended his right hand towards me. Without further thought, I grasped it and allowed him to pull me to my feet. As I tried to get my bearings, I noticed a change in the room. The fetters had been removed from the two girls on the bed. Now they both lay side by side under a thick woolen blanket. One of them had her eyes closed. The eyes of the other were still wide open and stared at the wall with the same dead gaze with which she had mustered Killian and me when we entered the room. Fire palm extract, Killian said. A droplet puts even a rabid boar to sleep. For a moment, a hint of grief, or was it rage, overshadowed his gaze. They do not want the goods to be able to resist. The goods, I replied, after a long pause, more statement than question. All of a sudden, I felt unbearably stupid. Yes. I gulped. Killian, I made a tired, all-encompassing gesture with my right hand. I don't understand. My voice sounded broken and dull. Not at all. Killian smirked. Then he sat on the edge of the bed and began to explain it all to me. 30 minutes later, which seemed like an eternity to me, Killian rang the room's bell. The girls were still asleep in the large bed, rigid and unmoving. Killian had given me a precious dagger before. It was of much better quality and easier to handle than my old iron knife. He had only nodded affirmatively in response to my insecure expression, like a gleeman who encouraged his son before his first performance. Now we were both standing by the door quietly. His eyes glowed like on the evening when he had first told me about the fire. But this time, there was also something else in his gaze. Anticipation. Footsteps approached, and I noticed how Killian subtly bent his knees. There was a knocking at the door. Killian rang the bell again, just as agreed upon with Conthis. The door opened a fraction. No one enters this world as a good or evil being, despite what the path would have you believe, JL. On the day of our birth, our souls are nothing but blank pages, and we alone decide what will be written upon them. A head peeked through the crack of the door. A bearded man with a broad mouth and a bulbous nose. His already large eyes widened when he saw Killian rush up to him. Unerringly and effortlessly, my companion drove his dagger up to the hilt into the employee's neck. The bearded man went down immediately. The sound of the body slumping to the floor reminded me of the fleshly pulped furs my father had tossed on the wooden planks of our home. The man blew out a last protesting rattle. Killian, meanwhile, looked as if he was frozen in place. His left eye jerked wildly to the right, his right eye in the opposite direction, and the corners of his mouth twitched up and down. I remembered my first killing, the images and the ecstasy that had accompanied them, the nectar of their sins. When he broke free from the paralysis, wiped a splatter of blood off his cheek, and grinned at me, I had not moved 1 finger's length. We write on the pages? A dark red puddle spread from under the dead man's back like the petals of a blooming rose. Killian turned away from the corpse and walked through the door. I staggered for a moment before I hastened after him. Figuratively speaking, yes, only we decide which way we go in our lives, the way of sin or the way of goodness. It is not easy to follow the path of good, JL. The temptation to be weak lurks in every corner. She wears the garments of greed, wrath, and weak will. We refer to these as the demons. Killian placed his hand flat against the steel door of the opposite room and held still. Each time we give in to them, we tread the path of sin a bit further. His lips moved, murmuring something I could not understand. The first few times we can still escape the demons. The more we sin, however, the worse it gets, and eventually, the steel door began to glow and emit smoke, but Kalian did not remove his hand. They own us. Heat and the smell of molten metal was starting to fill the hallway. These demons make tyrants, they make slavers, they make assassins. They are everywhere, and they bear different names. Finally, the door with the number 13 above it bent in the middle like a wet piece of paper. Kalian pulled his hand away, kicked the door open, and stepped into the room. Those who have devoted themselves completely to them we call the corrupted, for this is what they are. On the edge of a large bed sat a man with an aristocratic, lean face. I recognized him. He had waited with us in the parlor. In front of him knelt a young boy whose age I did not want to guess. I will spare you the details of the cruelty I had to witness. I was overwhelmed by the situation anyway, so I was not able to comprehend what was going on in that moment. I can only say that the sight of the man who had his mouth wide open in fright made my stomach tingle warmly. I felt my heartbeat accelerate and the blood heating up in my veins. They are the ones who are responsible for the evil in our world, the ones who are too weak to withstand the temptation, to resist the demons. It is because of them that there is war, suffering, and death. We, JL, we are exceptional, for we were born with a destiny, and, not hesitating for a second, Kalian strode towards the bed, pushed the boy aside with his boot, and plunged his dagger diagonally into the man's neck. The fire is running in our veins. A fountain of blood shot up, and this time death did not come quietly. The man let out a terrible scream and pressed both hands against the wound. For a few seconds, Kalian simply took in the scene with a smile, before finally grabbing the dying man and lifting him up with a force I would not have expected despite Kalian's athletic form. The fire. The man's agonized cries got louder. Through Kalian's garment I could see the muscles of his upper arms bulge. Then he squeezed. Blood streamed down his sleeves in a torrent, and I sensed a veil of heat forming around him. We do not know why we of all people were chosen, or where the force that guides us stems from, but we know one thing: we are here to protect the world and to cleanse it. Against all logic, I felt a euphoric joy while I watched the man die. My stomach fluttered and my knees grew weak. We judge him, flashed through my head. We judge him for his sins. My fingers clenched the dagger. My breath was fast and panting. Every muscle of my body was prepared to act. The man's death throes had become more quiet and breathy. Kalian's garment was now completely soaked with blood. Nausea stirred unexpectedly in me, bringing the taste of bile to the back of my mouth. This is insanity. This is murder, a voice inside me screamed, loud and clear, my old self. But at the same time, it was pathetic and weak, and it was wrong. So it is our task to murder all those who have given in to the demons? For anyone who made use of the services of this place deserved to die. They did it at the expense of young, innocent souls who had the misfortune of being too poor, too insignificant, or simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. The owners of the brothel had kidnapped them, drugged them, and subsequently offered them to those who were wealthy and ruthless enough to put their needs above ethics. They were sinners seized by demons. Alerted yells were audible from the hallway, and a couple of seconds later, there was the sound of hurried steps. They are coming, and they want to stop us. The thought occurred to me, with an almost indefinite serenity. I knew, that they would not have a hint of a chance. When the first person appeared by the door, Kalian released the aristocratic man's neck. He did not scream anymore, collapsing silently on the floor instead. Not all of them, there are too many, but those whose death the fire orders. Slowly, almost casually, Kalian turned towards me. The humanity I'd seen in his eyes a few heartbeats before was gone entirely. And this is the only reason for our existence, JL. We are the ones standing between mankind and its utter corruption, the depravity which stems solely from man's weakness. His face was wet with blood, red drops running down his cheeks. Some of them got caught in his beard, while others trickled from his chin like morning dew from the petals of red malthus flowers. The glow in his jet-black eyes could no longer be denied, even by the most pious, priestly part of my mind. The image that I still have before my eyes, even today, has at its center one feature of the man who could have arisen from the mind of a mad god: his grin. And this is exactly why we are here, JL. These people have devoted themselves to sin. They are corrupted, and only their death is going to... You're probably picturing the insane face of the evil mage from the theatre plays in your mind's eye, but you're wrong. If it had not been for the blood, the dead body, and the shivering boy, the smile could have been of that of a boy who was about to earn a penny in an honest manner. There was no sense of guilt in his face, no bloodlust, only bliss. Indeed, he looked at me as if his deed had been the most natural thing in the world, and he was right, I thought when I looked at him, for what we had done and what we were about to do was righteous. Every corner of this place was corrupted, and so were the people making use of its services, and here we were, to purify their souls. A shrill cry broke my trance. I heard how a sword was being drawn from its scabbard, and when I turned around, I saw the one who wielded it storm towards me. I was surprised that I felt by no means nervous or overwhelmed. In fact, it was as if time had slowed almost to the point of standing still. Every move of the man, every twitch of his muscles, the up and down of his chest when he breathed, I observed with a clarity I had never experienced before. I noticed how the grip of my hand tightened around the hilt of my dagger with almost stoic calmness. The fire swelled, the heat was growing inside of me. Then my legs moved in a way I had not believed possible before. I braced my thighs and bent my knees slightly. Driven by impulse, I leaped forward like a predator. I tensed the muscles in my right shoulder and angled my hip to the right and forward, which made my straightened right arm thrust forward like the bolt of a Pyrean ballista. My dagger drove deep into the man's heart. I'd cleanse him, I thought. A tingling exploded in my stomach and in my loins. The world stopped turning. I felt my spirit rise high above. Far away from my body, into blackness, into the light, I am free. I see him. I see them, his deeds, his sins. Brighter and brighter, I see them. I am one with his mind. The man who I am killing stands before me as a boy. We are in a dark alley. I hear screams. The boy kicks another child again and again until the child's face is but a shapeless lump. The body does not flinch anymore. The hand clutches a loaf of bread. His first sin. Lightning flashes through my mind, and I find myself inside another memory. This time he is a young man, sparsely bearded, but already scarred. He talks to another figure which is nodding approvingly. The right hand of the obsessed man grabs a knife and stabs it deep into the other's heart. Before his victim touches the ground, his left hand swiftly separates a coin purse from the belt. He runs away. The demons are inside of him, I realize with lucid clarity. He has allowed them to enter. Another flash. The obsessed man stands before me as an adult. I look directly into his face, but he does not see me. I do not have to search to glimpse the demons hiding behind the void of his eyes. They laugh maliciously, for they know of their triumph. They own him, I realize. He is lost. The man prostrates and talks to a young streetwalker. With his right hand, he plays with a penny. He turns and flips it in front of her eyes like a prestigigator on a fairground. I want to help her, want to tell her to run, but I can't. The girl agrees and starts to follow him. He knocks her down and drags her into a dark cellar. I recognize the building. My sight blurs and I feel the connection waning. A flash, then darkness. I see my mundane self close to the body of the one I have killed. For a moment, there is perfect silence. Nothing moves, no sound, no thought. I behold the man's face, distorted in pain, and a touch of melancholy sneaks into my thoughts. He is a slave to his sins. He does not know what he does. But he had a choice. He could have chosen the righteous path, but he chose sin. He chose the demons, and they have devoured him. I stare at my dagger buried firmly in his body. A fountain of blood sprays from the wound, but it reaches frozen and solid into the air, a piece of scarlet red, unmoving ice. There is no hope for him anymore, I realize. I have saved him. Suddenly, with a loud thunder, I am back inside my physical body. The fire devours me like a storm devours a small boat on the sea. It fills my veins with ecstasy, with liquid lava, and I burn like the sun. A mad laughter resounds from my throat. My mouth moves manically. I jerk like under the command of an insane puppeteer. I taste his sins, I realize, and the thought amplifies my excitement many times over. Then the rapture fades away as fast as it has risen. Even though it is a strong experience, this act of killing has not been half as intense as the first one. The reason seems obvious to me. While the sins of the brute I had killed in the red ox had been a rapid stream, the sins of the guard are but a trickle. I blink to remove the red veil from my eyes. I look at the man's face. His head leans on my shoulder, and my left hand rests on his back, as if I am comforting a friend. He gives me a pleading look and rattles. Then his vital spirits fade away, and he glides to the ground with a tired sigh. It was not until the ruby-red puddle reached my feet that I awoke from my trance. I was strangely moved, and my glance jumped between the dagger in my hands and the dead body. Only a hint of the tingling in my stomach remained. Everything had happened in a split second. The attack of the guard, my targeted thrust, and the rapture. I looked at Kalian, who still stood next to the dead client's body. He gave me a satisfied nod and wiped his dagger on the bedsheet. He approached the apathetic boy who was crouching by a wall. Even though his eyes were wide open, I noticed the same void which had rested in the eyes of the two girls. Kalian had ordered for us. My comrade knelt in front of the boy, put his bloody hand on his shoulder, and whispered something to him. When the boy looked at him uncomprehendingly, Kalian repeated his words with a fuller voice. The boy nodded and crawled underneath the bed. "You're keeping up well," Kalian remarked. I wanted to respond, but failed. The aftertaste of the rapture was too powerful. Only now did I realize that my knees and hands were shaking. My brother appeared amused by that. He shook his head leniently, got up, and peeked into the hallway. "The other guards will come in dozens," he said, without a trace of uneasiness. If we had been robbers, murderers, or brigands who had raided an inn for base motives, something like get ready or stay close in the fight would have followed. But he said nothing, for the silence which surrounded us like a veil of heat did the flames, told us all we needed to know. Indeed, the fire steered me, and with it inside me I would save all the dead souls that inhabited this place, visitors and operators alike. Conthis, Yelena, the woman in the parlor, they had all given in to the demons, and it did not matter if they had done so for all their life, or just one time too often. I nodded at Kalian. The words blazing at me from his eyes were unmistakable. Fulfill your duty. I remember only fragments of what happened during the following minutes, or hours. How many people did we kill? 24? 3? I do not know anymore. Most of my memories revolved around the rapture their deaths brought. The enemies fell under my thrusts like in the old legends of the Ash people. I escaped their pitiful attempts at defense with ease, and before I realized what happened, my blade sunk into flesh and I savored their sins. I remember how I had looked in a mirror during the fight. My face was dripping with blood, my garment red, like Hyranian sunrise, and my eyes glowed with mania I only knew from fairy tales. I was not surprised by the fact that some of the guards tried to flee when they saw us, but it was in vain. None of the corrupted left the brothel alive. One killing I do remember particularly well. When we arrived on the second floor, we surprised a man who was trying to unlock a balcony door. Once he noticed us, he fell to his knees and begged for mercy. Kalian grabbed the man by his collar and dragged him to an adjacent room. A half-Eterna of about 16 winters lay on the bed. She was stark naked and her limbs were tied to the bedposts. The chains were so tight that bloody blue calluses had formed on her wrists and ankles. With remarkable sobriety, I noticed that the girl must once have been very pretty. Her hair was an ocean of brown curls, and her face was of a delicate, fragile beauty, as it could only be found with those of Eterna blood. However, she had been horribly disfigured. Deep wounds covered her back like furrows on a freshly ploughed field. Numerous bruises were blooming on her thighs and arms. All injuries were fresh, indicating that she had been mistreated this very morning. Kalian grabbed the old man's neck and forced him to look at her while he whispered words into his ear. The client burst into tears, asked for mercy, spoke about his family, the path, and the righteous way. I had to laugh. Facing death, everyone regretted their deeds that had come clear to me after my third killing. Even if we had wanted to forgive them, we would not have been able to. Whoever had sinned once would sin again. The demons would see to that. That was what Kalian told the man, but he remained stubborn and undiscerning, assured that he would repent. Eventually, I decided to end the tragedy. In contrast to my previous killings, which I'd performed with my dagger, I instinctively reached for the cat of nine tails the man had used to torture his slave. He struggled and winced, but Kalian gripped him tightly until I had strangled him. The taste of his sin was stale, corruption, fraud. He was a bad man, a bad father, and the act of torture he had performed today, and which had cost him a considerable amount of gold, had been the first of its kind. When he eventually collapsed in front of me, a beautifully embroidered leather purse fell out of his garment. Its contents spread across the floor next to my blood-smeared boots. I was about to turn away when I noticed a shimmering golden item, a brooch on which a bear's head had been finely engraved, a family crest. Bewildered, I showed my finding to Kalian. We had killed a nobleman, someone of the sublime path. What would the repercussions be for us? His answer was the one he frequently gave me, regardless of the question: a smile. Yelena, the cold-eyed beauty, was the one who defended herself best. Instead of trying to escape like the others, she ambushed us in the hallway. The fight between her and Kalian lasted a good minute, but considering the ease with which he blocked her attacks, I assumed that he only dragged the sparring out for amusement. When the woman's concentration wavered for a split second, Kalian had already plunged his dagger deep into her abdomen. She doubled over with a gasp, vainly trying to keep the dark blood from pouring out of the wound. She opened her mouth to say something, but never got the chance to do so. With a massive targeted blow, Kalian separated her head from her torso. For several heartbeats, he squinted as his face was flooded with bliss, and the heat in the room increased to a degree that even I could barely stand. Less than 5 minutes later, Conthis uttered his final cry too. Like the others, he begged for mercy, vowed betterment, promised us gold and women, and moments later, we'd escaped from the shadows of the Undercity. Chapter 8. Masks. 3 months passed before Kalian considered me worthy of performing the ritual, which would make me a full-fledged brother of the Black Libra. He asked me if I really wanted to take the path now that I was aware of its true nature. The fact that I stayed was answer enough. After all, what else should I have done? I had fled from an undefined fear, leaving my old life in order to find out where it came from. As absurd as it might sound to you, I had the feeling that I had found the right path in Kalian and the fire. We are born as servants of the Libra, he had told me one evening, but it is up to us to discover our purpose. He himself was the son of a nobleman, he had confided in me. Although unlike me, he remembered the first years of his life. He had always had the vague sense that he was destined to be someone different. In his mind, too, something had been hidden which he was unable to explain, and he had also experienced these fleeting moments during which this something crossed the threshold into his consciousness. His first cleansing had been a crucial experience. An assassin had been hired by a hostile family to seek revenge. She had been disguised as a maid and had entered his rooms, but he had seen through the disguise and defeated the hired murderer. The nectar of her sins had been the first step for him. He would not tell me what other obstacles had awaited him after this moment. I only knew that I was about to overcome one. I did not mind the uncertainty during the long wait. I learned a lot, and for the first time in my life, I felt like someone special. How foolish all the people on the streets seemed to me. Full of ignorance, they lived their ordinary lives, prayed to the gods, and believed that abidance to the path and godliness alone were enough to protect them from the abyss. Alas, how deluded they were. There was no higher power to free us from the responsibility to protect us from sin. We alone decided what we gave in to and when we acted weakly. People do not want to carry responsibilities for themselves, my friend, Kalian had said to me one time. They never have. More and more, I began to view the world as a game board. The stars, nature, or gods foreign to us had set the rules, and now delightfully observed how mankind struggled to cope. Maybe they had the power to remove temptation and sin from the world. I did not know. Nevertheless, evil was not supposed to get the upper hand, and that was why we were who we were. It was uplifting to be a sighted man among the blind. So many times in my old life I had felt powerless, angry about how little justice I found in our world. How many times, even in my small village, I had seen a guilty, sinful man avoid his just punishment because of status, prestige, or gold, while a vagrant got thrown into the dungeon for stealing a chicken. These events embittered me, but I used to assume that this was simply the way of the world. The Black Libra, however, had changed everything, and the thought of being part of it filled me with such triumph and euphoria I could scarcely contain it. Had this been the reason for my anxiety? That I, J.L. Tannerson, had always sensed my true destiny? To bring justice to the world? Even now, after I've realized the insanity of the Libra, I cannot answer the question. I just know that it felt right back then. As opposed to what you may think, we brothers of the Libra did not choose our victims arbitrarily. When a corrupted was responsible for too many sins, the member chosen for the killing was informed about the mission by a letter. I never understood how these letters always found their destination, regardless of location and circumstances. They contained only two pieces of information: a drawing of the damned likeness and a name. The rest, collecting further information and planning the assassination, was the chosen's task. Before my trial, Kalian received 4 such letters, and I witnessed 3 of the killings. You might wonder about the casualness with which I write about it, but as I said, there is almost no situation the human mind will not adapt to. I adapted to the cleansings. They were always justified, however cruel they appeared. All the people we killed were corrupted and had managed to evade justice with wealth or cunning, but they could not evade us. The Libra was older than Enderal, the Lightborn, perhaps even the Tides. Nobody knew which prince, god, or shapeless entity pulled the strings, and nobody knew how the chosen ones differed from the common people. Even if I had been able to, I would never have investigated the matter. I did not care why. I had met Kalian and where the strange vision had its origin. With the fire in my blood, I was not just anyone anymore. I was special. That was exactly what I felt when I sat next to Kalian in a carriage 3 months later. The time had come. I had been told. I was worthy now. Worthy. I wanted to look out the window, but I was reminded that the glass was veiled by black cloth. No beam of light entered the cabin. Only a lantern on the ceiling emitted some light. You'll have to get used to this, Kalian said. Even I don't know the locations of the bastions. Bastions? The strongholds, their temples. There's one on each continent, but nobody knows where they are. I nodded. If I were a spy, I'd be able to blow the cover. You wouldn't, Kalian responded. The Black Libra can be shattered, as much as a forbidden thought can be erased. It's impossible. You can prohibit it by law, you can burn writings about it, but it will never vanish. This trial is not about your loyalty, he continued. If you weren't loyal, I would have killed you long ago. What is it about, then? About limits. He paused a moment as if he was sorting his words in the right order to give me just enough information. You may believe that you have already crossed them, but you haven't. Deep inside, he pointed between my eyes with his index finger. They still exist. We who have fully committed ourselves to the Libra, we are different than other people, JL. I nodded. The fire. Yes, the fire, but don't be mistaken. You don't know everything about it. You've been guided by its force. You feel its voice inside of you, and you have tasted the sins of the obsessed ones. However, this is only a part of what constitutes a true servant of the Libra. My stomach itched as if the fire approved of Kalian's words. His words resounded in my mind. I realized I was still separated by miles from my comrade and mentor. Aside from the obvious, his skillful killings and his confidence, there was more than I was not able to explain. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that it was something in his gaze, something in the way he viewed the world. Lucid was the word that came to mind. And what exactly is the rest? I finally asked. Boundlessness, he replied. Total commitment. Seeing my confused face, he smiled. It is what you've been searching for all your life without finding it. It is what we all strive for, but only few are destined to experience. He leaned back and crossed his legs, and you have the opportunity to be one of them. I did not respond, knowing Kalian would not, could not, tell me more. About an hour later, we arrived. The mummed coachman who had wordlessly picked us up in the evening opened the door, holding a piece of black cloth in his right hand. I was unable to recognize anything other than the clear light of the stars outside. Kalian took the cloth with both hands. I'm sorry, but this is necessary. I realized what he was about to do and did not resist. The cloth slipped quietly over my head and everything became pitch black. Then Kalian took my hand and guided me outside. The air I inhaled was cold, Something crunched beneath my feet when I walked. Snow. "Come," I heard my comrade's voice, and felt a slight pull on my left arm. I followed him. After what I estimated to be another half an hour, I entered the Enderalian bastion of the Libra for the first time. The echoes of our footsteps indicated that we had entered a cave of sorts. A few moments later, the sound of several other voices mingled with ours. I was told to sit down. My blindfold was removed, but I was ordered not to open my eyes before I heard the ring of a bell. "Watch closely," Kalian had whispered before the voices, and footsteps faded away, and a large door was shut. Dutifully, I kept my eyes closed. A bright ringing sounded. I was in a large round room with high walls and a dome-shaped ceiling which struck me as the interior of a chapel. It was empty except for numerous candlesticks with crimson flames and a symmetrical column of tall, evenly spaced pillars leading to the other side. Only at second glance did I notice the painting on the walls. The painting was different from what I was used to from Enderalian temples. It did not depict the Lightborn or the 12 stages of the pioneer's journey. It was divided into 9 different pictures. I turned my head to the left to examine the picture next to me. It showed an athletic man standing on an uneven stone road leading up a hill. He was naked except for a loincloth. The environment was barren and tundra-like, grandly lit by the bright and clear moonlight. The man had averted his gaze from the moon. He wore a simple steel mask. It had no ornamentation, only 2 narrow slits for the eyes, yet something about it fascinated me in a manner I was unable to describe. It appeared to be impeccable. Every muscle of the man's body was tensed. He held both his hands up to the sky, as if he was expecting a divine blessing. I stared at the picture for an endlessly long time. It emitted something that could be described as an aura, and it elicited both joy and anxiety. Only minutes later, I spotted a small writing in the bottom right corner of the painting. I squinted my eyes to read it. The Renaissance. I kept my eyes on the picture for a few more moments, frowned, and turned away. The painting was fascinating, but I had to perform a trial, even though I was not yet aware of its nature, so I looked ahead again and waited. However, nothing happened, and I was starting to feel uneasy. What was expected of me? I looked uncertainly behind me. The steel door was closed. Maybe I'm supposed to prove patience. I tried to calm my thoughts. I lowered my gaze and tried to meditate, as Kalian had taught me. 5 minutes passed, 10, nothing. I felt my stomach rumble and called myself a fool because I had not eaten anything before our hasty departure. Just stretching my legs, I'm sure nobody would mind. My knees cracked while I got up. My calves tingled from sitting still for so long. Carefully and slowly, I walked through the room, as if my observers would be offended by any sudden movement. I hoped for deliverance from the uncertainty by a strange, mysterious voice, or the arrival of another person. It was in vain. 2 hours passed, and not even a grain of dust seemed to have moved in the sacral hall. Only then did it dawn on me that nobody was going to show up. Whatever this trial was about, I was expected to act on my own. But what was I supposed to do? I was certain that the way to passing the test did not lead through the door behind me, so I searched for a hidden clue in the room. Helplessness took root in my stomach. What was this? Some test of my willpower? Such nonsense, I thought angrily. I suppressed the urge to walk back to the door and knock. What will they do with those who do not pass the test? I had an inkling, but I was not eager to learn more about it. Kalian should have warned me, I thought with bitterness, or he should at least have watched closely. I halted. Had it been a clue? But about what? The room was empty except the paintings. Of course, how could I have been so blind? I had considered the pictures to be mere decoration. How could the key to this trial be hidden in them? I hastily turned around and stopped in front of the picture on the right side of the door. If the paintings are connected, and the left picture showing the man, the Renaissance, is the last one, then this one must be the first. I observed the painting with uncertainty. It also portrayed a man, naked, looking at the spectre. He wore a mask, just like the man in the Renaissance, and even though he was less athletic, he appeared to be the same person. The mask, however, was different. It was made from thin, skin-colored cloth, and it seemed rather like a second skin to me, tight and fissured like that of a dying old man. I averted my eyes with a feeling of disgust I could not explain and examined the rest of the picture. At first, I thought that the reflective surface on which the man stood was a floor of polished stone, but then I realized that it was still water. The area around the man was filled with wafts of mist, and only a few pine trees drifting in the water in a surreal manner filled the scenery. What is this supposed to mean? For a while, I admired the painter's artful brushstrokes. The pictures had been made with oil paint, yet they seemed strangely alive. How many artists in the world could boast such expertise? Not many, I guessed. Something had been written on this image as well. The limbus. My brow furrowed. Arcanists called the state of derangement after overstraining one's mental capacities the limbus. I pondered about the word, but eventually shook my head and moved on to the second image. The pictures were skillfully interwoven with each other. The second emerged from the mist in the first painting and depicted the heaven from the bird's view. The clouds were like rising smoke, drowned in sanguine light from the pale red horizon. In the center was the silhouette of a man. He hung from the sky by silken threads, like a sun god's puppet, and his mouth was opened wide as if in a scream. This picture was also titled enigmatically, The Washing. That name triggered a memory in me. Hadn't I read about a ritual with this name? Yes, I confirmed my own thought. The nomadic journey of the Kyranians when they head off to find the Red Mountain. Before they leave, they must perform a symbolic cleansing in one of their holy rivers, allegedly to discard their former self. A new beginning, so to say a spiritual cleansing. Could this be the meaning of the picture? I quickly looked around. I was still alone. The third scene of the painting, which was similarly interwoven with the one before, showed the naked man covered in dirt and soaking wet, dragging himself to the coast, probably out of the mist-shrouded sea behind him. Its title was The First Stone. The sun shone on the man's body, and its light formed the foundation for the picture beside it, which aroused shame in me. It showed the stranded man, who now looked more athletic and nourished than in the last image, making love to a woman. His skin glazed glistening with sweat, and splatters of blood sparkled on his chest. He wore a mask of cloth, beneath which a diabolical grin could be seen. The woman with whom the man had intercourse had her back turned to him. She was stylized in an unconventional way. Her long plaited hair hung down her back like a torrent of black pearls, and two horns emerged from her forehead. Her face remained hidden from the viewer. The couple's environment resembled a butchery. Puddles of blood shone on the floor, and a corpse lay by the man's feet. I knelt down and read the title, The First Blaze. Only when I read the last words, the scales fell from my eyes. Yes, JL, this is a development, it shot through my head. A transformation. I had no idea whether it was by chance or by design that the man in the first painting walked through layers of fog, but there was no doubt it was me, before the vision had occurred to me, when I lived in the grey drabness which I had called my home, always aware how my life lagged behind my true determination. In Limbus, the washing was nothing short of the vision that had torn me from this life. The first stone was my escape from Fogville, and the first blaze, a cold shudder went down my spine, was my first killing. I moved on to painting number 5. Again the man, this time seated in front of the weathered fountain inside an overgrown temple courtyard. Instead of the cloth mask, he now wore one of the razor-thin metal, but his face was still visible underneath. At this side sat a woman with fiery red hair. The picture was titled The Companion, and I instantly understood its meaning. Even though Kalian was not a woman, and our first conversation had not taken place in a beautiful ruin, it was without any doubt Kalian who had saved me from the chaos I experienced after my first encounter with the fire. For none of this is coincidental. Had Kalian known that I was a potential brother, that the fire was running through my veins? His curious gaze when I had entered the tavern suggested that this was the case. If the paintings thus far show my development, then the following ones might help me through this trial. Pushed on by the thought, I continued the examination. I suspected what the next picture would show, and my expectations were met. Its title was The Reign of Flames, and it depicted the unknown man and the red-haired woman on the battlefield. His mask appeared to be more sturdy now, and a gloomy sky full of foreboding clouds and only perforated by 3 dying beams of sunlight added a cataclysmic atmosphere to the image. The man and the woman stood back to back. The woman's face expressed lust, and pugnacity. I don't know what that means. Bodies covered in blood, with asymmetrical and browless faces, were scattered across the ground. The image symbolized without any doubt the incident in the Undercity. Kalian's lesson. The painting to the right showed the woman holding out her hand to the man. If I had not seen the images preceding it, I would probably have considered it gaudy. The time of rest. My heart was pounding. The parallels between the pictures and my previous experiences ended here. After the time of rest, which in a way described my apprenticeship with Kalian, I had been taken to the trial. The solution to the riddle had to be in the final 2 wall paintings, one of which I had already seen when I had first opened my eyes. My eyes grew heavy and I shivered slightly as I looked at the picture which had been hidden in the shadows of the pillars. The present. The man was inside a circular room. His face was still covered by a steel mask, but in the candlelight of the hall it was clearly visible that the metal was not perfect. No, the man's face was still quite recognizable beneath, and it looked weak. A surge of disgust rose inside me, which I could not explain. The naked man knelt in the center of the large hall, his sickly and elegiac face raised towards the ceiling of the painting, his arms limply hanging down by his sides. His body was smooth and shining, his skin covered with brown stains. What? With the realization came panic. I stared at the painting. At first, I could not believe what my eyes were seeing. When I took a closer look, my doubts were erased by the accurate brush marks. I had deceived myself with my first glance. The stains covering the man's body were not brown, but red. They were not mud or grime, but blood. A horizontal cut had opened the man's throat, and blood poured down his chest. Now I noticed the small items on his left, which had undoubtedly slipped from his weak hand. A dagger. Instinctively, I averted my face and stepped back. No, I thought. No further reflections were necessary to comprehend the painting's message. I was expected to kill myself. It is hard to tell what I felt at that moment. I was most hesitant to strip myself naked like my oil paint alter ego, but after a minute of pondering, I did. I had to. By no means did I want to kneel in the center of the room like a believer expecting a blessing, but I did. Never in my life had I experienced more anxiety. I raised the dagger to my throat. My inner ear heard a disgusting tearing sound, supplied by the memory of my first killing. No man in his right mind would have used the knife on himself, with shaking hands, closed eyes, his body coated with cold sweat, his eyes closed like a child who tries to wake from a nightmare. However, a man in his right mind would not have followed the vision. A man in his right mind would have accepted the punishment in the stables, wandering off with a few bruises and ruptures, and no man in his right mind was chosen by the Black Libra. I squeezed my eyes further shut and clenched my shaking hand around the hilt of the weapon. In that moment, I wanted nothing more than to wake up from this ludicrous nightmare, to let the cold steel fall to the ground, to stand up and escape somehow. Boundlessness. I sliced. Chapter 9. The Rise. After I'd slit my own throat, there was initially only room in my head for astonishment. I was not in pain, even though I clearly felt the cut in my throat. Instead, I felt a sober certainty. I had killed myself. I closed my eyes and waited. Hot, wet blood flowed down my chest in a macabre stream. The pain exploded after exactly 27 seconds. I tried to scream, but only managed a choked rattle. I collapsed and rolled on my side, knees drawn to my chest like a freezing child. After 96 seconds, my field of vision had become like the view through a dirty dark red-colored glass pane, and my body was flagged. The red puddle under me had grown to man-size, and I asked myself if the numerous animals my foster father or his suppliers had killed in order to obtain their beautiful furs had felt the same. After 105 seconds, I felt life melt away and a pleasant drowsiness take over. How nice it would be to simply close my eyes and sleep, forever and ever, in peace and tranquility. After 150 seconds, I stopped counting and woke up. The first change I noticed was one that was hard to describe, a vague, disconcerting feeling rather than obvious observation. Although the room around me had appeared superficially the same, I sensed that something was wrong, like a deformed man trying to hide his true face behind a mask. Another change was of a physical nature and much more unmistakable. I noticed it when I instinctively placed my right hand on my chest. My heart was not beating anymore. I palpitated my neck in disbelief. The cut was still there, but the flow of blood had stopped. My sight was back to normal, my mind just as clear. I noticed a third change when I looked around. The paintings had come to life. The mist in the washing swirled around. Oil paint lightning flashed on the horizon, fading to a milky grey after the momentary brightness. The man in the image was hovering up and down like a forgotten corpse in the ocean. I could scarcely believe my own eyes. Perhaps the lack of a heartbeat was causing issues with my vision after all. My gaze passed the first stone and the first blaze, the same thing. Every painting was moving. The sun rays from the time of rest blinded me, and the thick blood seeping from the neck of the man in the painting, the present, depicting the trial. My eyes jumped from painting to painting. I was still struggling to make sense of what I was seeing when I heard a sound like cloth being torn, and all the masked faces of the painted figures simultaneously looked in my direction. They stared at me, and even though their masks at least partially covered their eyes, I felt their gaze on me like a dark power. I should have been afraid, but instead the fire sparked and slowly awoke inside me. They don't want to harm me, I realized in a flash. They want to guide me. I watched the figures leave their paintings. Liquid paint trickled from them, forming colourful splatters on the stone floor. For a few seconds they stood motionless in front of their abandoned paintings. Then they marched lockstep toward me. Their steps produced no sound, only the dripping of paint made a surreal noise in the eerily quiet chamber. With every step they took, the sparks of fire inside me intensified, brightened. The painted figures formed a circle around me, as if they had rehearsed to synchronize their movements. They all raised their right hand and moved it to their faces. Slowly and firmly, my eyes shifted over the figures, eager not to miss any detail. The sight of them elicited varying emotions from me. I despised the thin man from the limbus, how weak he was, how pathetic. Hope arose in me when I looked at the man from the first blaze. The man from the Renaissance, the painting I had studied first, I adored. He emitted dignity and power, such as I had never felt before. Nothing could penetrate the cold steel of his mask. He had crossed the limit. He was perfect. The fire now filled every part of my body, my arms, my chest, my legs, and my loins. You have chosen the right way, I heard a whisper inside my own head. Now let yourself go. I sighed like a man who held his lover in his arms after years of separation. Then I nodded to the oil figures. They removed their masks, and I screamed. Here some pages were neatly cut from the original manuscript. Okay, they're the lost pages that we had to find. I opened my eyes again. I was stark naked, lying on the warm stone floor of the hall, but I was not bleeding anymore. Immediately, my hand shot to my throat. The wound was gone, though the blood had left a sticky, slowly drying trail on my neck, my chest, and the floor. Half relieved, half shocked, I opened my mouth and gasped for air. I relaxed and stared at the ceiling. A warm, flaring sensation washed over my body. I had passed the trial. I knew it as much as I knew that I would be haunted until the end of my days by what I had seen beneath the masks of my painted counterparts. A sound of disbelief meant to be a laugh left my throat. I had made it. I had seen it. And now I was a brother of the Black Libra. A sense of power rose in me as I thought this. This power was different from what the Arcanists did when they let eventualities become truth, or from how the shamans connected to the ghost world through their singing. The magic of the Libra was different, pristine, immaculate. With effort, I turned my head and looked at the paintings. The masked man from the last painting was gone. I was not surprised. When I rose, I was overcome with a heavy tiredness. Slowly, I got dressed and picked up my dagger from the floor. The blood on its blade was still fresh. I stared at it for a long time before wiping it clean on my trousers and putting it back into its sheath. After that, I left the hall. Oh, how complete I felt that day. My chronicle nears its end, and I do not want to waste time with unnecessary narrations. Time runs faster than the ink on this paper dries, and I am greatly exhausted by the events of the past few days. Reading the previous page fills me with anger. How inappropriate my descriptions are, how fragile my thoughts. I can merely hope that they will suffice. Let me begin the final part with a correction. Contrary to the claims of some people, I am no unprincipled murderer. Everything I have written thus far is truthful, no matter how bizarre it may sound. The Black Libra had chosen me, long before I knew about it. It had found me, it had given me a taste of my destiny, and had made me one of their own. If there was one area the Libra was infallible, it was this. Everyone they killed was corrupted. They had sinned, were guilty of crimes, they were evil. Name it however you like. At first, I assured myself regarding the target's nature before each killing. Later, the superficial proof I had was sufficient to me. Not once was the Libra wrong. No matter how inconspicuous the target, they were all sinners. So do not bother wondering whether my victims were innocent, for they were not. Rather ask yourselves, was it right to kill them? Back then, I believed it was. The teachings of the Libra guided me, and it was so simple. We have a choice. We decide whether we invite the demons by committing sins. We decide to become corrupted. We, the chosen of the Libra, punish those who are weak. Not all of them, but enough. Enough so that the innocent ones are protected, so that fear enters the sinner's heart, so that the world is preserved from ultimate corruption. Today, I remember the pride I felt when I faced Kalian and the others with a tired smile. Not many were present, a dozen, maybe less. Nobody applauded or cheered, since it was unnecessary. The men and women who were there knew what I had seen and done. Nevertheless, I was surprised when Kalian told me that it was time to return to Ark. I briefly shook the hands with those who had also had the fire within, and then I sat in the dark interior of the coach again, confused, exhausted, but full of pride. He did not answer my question on why we had to leave so soon. Even today, many structures of the Libra are a mystery to me, and each time I ponder on them, I realize how little I knew. How should I? Not even 6 months later, I betrayed the Libra, and it was naive to believe that the survival of the trial was all that constitutes a carrier of the fire. No, there was so much more. Hierarchies, rituals, stories, none of which I would ever get to know. Everything happened quickly once back in Ark. Kalian taught me the art of sword fighting and the importance of regular meditation. It was not before long that I observed its effects. Each morning I felt more awake and more powerful. I smiled about the people surrounding me, their clumsiness and inertia. Everything around me seemed so clear. Only 3 days later, Kalian gave me a sealed document in which I was ordered to kill in the name of the Libra for the first time. I would like to claim that I still remember all my victims, but I don't. The only memories that never fade are those of the nectar. The procedure was always the same. After receiving the victim's name, I began to research the target and fleshed out a plan. The Black Libra granted me every resource I needed: gold, weapons, poison. When I requested them in a letter that I handed to the concealed coachman, when I was alone with my victims, I killed them and consumed their memories. When I covered my tracks, many people admire my perfidy and my cunning plans, as I was never caught. However, I don't think of myself as particularly intelligent or sly. I seem to have a certain talent for killing, yet I made many mistakes that could have cost me my life. I was protected by the Libra. With each killing I performed successfully, Kalian disappeared more and more from my life. He was a mentor, and with the completion of my apprenticeship, his duty was fulfilled. At first I regretted it and missed his presence, but gradually I started to enjoy the silence and solitude. I had enough gold to fulfill every mundane wish, and I was surprised how quickly wine and love for sale lost their taste to me. In the autumn of the year 8088, 4 months after my trial, I mostly spent my evenings alone in the room of an inn, or walking through nature, or the city. I took my time to observe people, how little attention I received. My inconspicuous, not particularly attractive appearance did not remind anyone of the illusionary conceptions of a hired killer. A tall and athletic man with a hooded, concealed face and a malicious smile. I enjoyed the anonymity and the role I had to play. I considered myself a quiet wanderer and a servant of justice who wiped the corrupted ones from life like the summer wind withered leaves from the trees. My fate was not easy to bear. Never again would I be able to fulfill mundane dreams. Never again would I be able to truly love someone. Yet I was part of something without which our world had fallen into the abyss, rotten with sinful people. The others were blinded. I saw. I never could have guessed how soon everything would change. The day began like any ordinary day. Already a few months into the new year, I woke before sunrise after a dreamless sleep, and I felt pleasantly calm when I got up. I had accommodated myself in the Dancing Nomad, a popular tavern near the city gates of Ark. The stir after my recent murder had already ceased, and nobody had asked me about my path or my origin when I paid for my room for 3 weeks in advance from a well-filled penny pouch. My gaze wandered thoughtfully through the cozy room, halting on the extinguished fireplace. I yawned and rubbed my eyes. When will it happen again? The snow lay thick on the trees, but it was beginning to melt in the sun. Soon it will be spring. The thought made me melancholic. I imagined children running across blooming meadows and the craftsmen of Ark gathering below the green oak trees in the tavern garden. For the first time in a long time, I longed for company. I meditated, lit a fire in the cold hearth, and had a sparse meal for breakfast. It was not until I left the room for a walk that I noticed the paper with a red slipknot under the gap of my door. I recognized it instantly. It was from the Black Libra. With a joyful feeling of anticipation that welcomed after my gloominess, I crouched, took the parchment, and opened it. I read it letter by letter and repeated it after I had finished. Then I threw it into the fire. When the document turned to ashes, I was filled with an uneasiness I cannot explain to this day. It was different from the dull anxiety from my past life that I had chased away, and that, as I had noticed, always appeared when I questioned my own deeds. But it had the same shade nonetheless. I ignored it, lit a candle, and sat down at the small wooden table by the window to come up with a plan. 3 days later, I left the inn on a newly bought horse. Spring was closing in, and the days were still short, and I planned to return to Ark before darkness, which I did. I handed the reins of my horse to the stable lad of the tavern, tossed him a penny, and made my way inside. Back in my room, I arranged the tools for the upcoming cleansing on the bed, like a cutler at his market stall. My target, a young woman, was easy prey. I could feel it. And so I had free choice. I decided to go for the long dagger I had used to help Kalian in the brothel. I pondered my plan until a short time before midnight, I left the Dancing Nomad. The night was starry and relatively warm for the season. Melting snow fell from the roofs with a heavy, crispy noise. According to the document, I could find my target in a noble house in one of the most expensive streets in town. It's always the rich who believe themselves to be above everything else, I bitterly thought when I approached the gates of the noble's quarter. I showed my papers to the guard and they let me in with a nod. If only they knew. It did not take long until I arrived at my destination. Like all houses in the noble's quarter, it was impressive, surrounded by high walls, with a heavy, sturdy gate set in a stone arch. The portcullis was closed, but behind it, the paved path leading to the entrance of the estate was visible. The 2 towers on the eastern and western side of the abode gave it an appearance of a castle. In my former life, thoughts of the costs of such a luxurious building would have brought me down to my knees, but now I only mustered it coldly. I could not see any guards, but a flickering light in the gatehouse indicated that it was occupied. I counted on that. I circled the estate twice. At the back, it was protected by the King's Rock, and it was flanked by other nobles' houses on both sides. On the west side of the wall, just a few arms' lengths from where it merged with the rock, I found what I was searching for. Finally. My stomach tingled, and the ash began to glow. The place I had chosen for my plan was a nice bench on the shore of the Malphus River, which rippled sublimely through the nocturnal scenery. From there I had a clear view through the gate to the estate of the sinner. It was cold, but it was not freezing. A grey-haired man and a young woman passed by and smiled at me. I smiled back. Then the path leading to the estate erupted into flames with a loud thunder. A cold shudder went down my spine, while sweat formed on my forehead. The reactions I had counted on came quickly. First, the couple noticed the fire. The young woman uttered a shrill cry and clung to her lover. Shortly thereafter, I heard the sound of boots on cobblestones approaching. The scent of smoke filled the air, and I was unable to fight a silent smile. Then I, too, made a frightened face and ran away, seemingly in a panic. But unlike the others, I did not run from the estate or towards it. Contentedly, I noticed that the doors were wide open. 2 guards rushed outside. Another guard exited the gatehouse, helplessly looking at his colleagues and the burning trees which illuminated the night like torches in a funeral march. No one noticed that the fire did not spread. I had no intention of causing a large-scale blaze, since I did not want innocent people to get hurt. I was only interested in the man who was going to die tonight. I freed my face from the fake, panicked expression the moment I entered the darkness of the street, which ran along the side of the estate. I slowed down my pace and retrieved an iron hook from my pocket. I stopped at the section of the wall I had chosen for my plan. It was 3 times my height, but it was old and fissured. I checked for gaps and pulled myself up with the aid of my hook. Once on top of the wall, I lay flat and analysed the situation. The trees were still burning bright, and the porter had opened the gate. Just as I was looking down, 2 city guards ran through the open gate, but they stopped and looked around helplessly. The porter shouted something at them, which I couldn't understand. 4 more people, most likely members of the estate's staff, had left the building and joined the 2 guards. Perfect. I slid down the wall and hid behind a bush. Now was the time. I closed my eyes and listened to the blaze inside me. It was content and felt, just like myself, the nearing nectar. Soon, I murmured. I looked at the hedge which had been planted directly in front of the house. I felt a greedy, affirmative tingling at the tensing of my muscles. It shot up my body through my ribs, my neck, and my skull, out of my eyes. I gasped and reeled. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the hedges started to burn. I sighed and smiled, as if I were congratulating myself. If the hedges had caught on fire as suddenly as the trees, a trained eye could have noticed the magic behind the events. It still seemed unusual, but not like witchcraft. A young man was the first to notice the apparent spreading of the fire. He reacted with a quite unmanly cry. In the meantime, some of the city guards had arrived. They were pulling a fire cart behind them, one of the startling inventions I had never learned to understand. By constantly turning a crank, it could be used to shoot a straight beam of water from a bronze barrel. Its arrival made me hurry. The inhabitants, who had been indecisive until now, fled along the brightly burning passage toward the gate. I hastened silently to the side of the mansion and pressed myself against the wall. I searched for a delivery door at the back. Every estate had one of these, so sacks of flour, meat, and vegetables for the kitchen did not have to be carried through the front door. While I snuck along the wall, I heard how the water from the fire cart fizzled into the cold night. I need to hurry up, I thought, though without any of the nervousness or panic I had felt in my earlier life. I put my hand on the lock, conjured the fire, and watched it melt away. Then I carefully opened the door and went inside. The storeroom smelled of salted meat, onions, and alcohol, and after a while I found a suitable hiding place between 3 chests. I smiled, took a deep breath, and extinguished the fire. It was only a matter of patience now. I estimated that it was 3 hours past midnight when I decided to begin. My plan was perfect. Everyone had acted just as I had foreseen. I knew it even though only a few noises clued me in on what was happening. As expected, the panic had cooled down when the fire slowly diminished. With amusement, I imagined the faces of the guards when they had realized that the flames in the treetops did not perish, no matter how much water they sprayed at them. They could have tried to extinguish it until the Black Guardian awakens, I thought. Only after my silent command had the flames begun to retreat, slow and reluctant like a wolf being forced to leave prey it had killed in a clearing without savoring its meat. After 3 hours, all the voices outside had become quiet. The door had opened and closed several times, and after some angry shouts from a man, definitely my target, there had been silence. Without any doubt, he would be looking for someone to blame tomorrow, I thought bitterly, and he would find someone. I summoned the document before my mind's eye. Mitamil Daljol, 24, winters old, and a murderer. Although the records of the Black Libra claimed that the demons had taken possession of him only a few moons ago, they had caused more damage through him than with others in an entire lifetime. He had sinned 3 times, and every time he had gotten away with gotten away unatoned. Young Daljal, whose father had died this year, was considered impulsive and irascible, traits which would have gotten any young man of lower status in trouble soon. Yet his father, a wealthy clothier who, according to rumors, had simply earned his noble title by mercantile success, had used his contacts to protect him from any consequences. It's a shame, perhaps if it hadn't been too late back then. The first murder had been committed late summer. He had strangled a chambermaid in his quarters after abusing her. The murder had been pinned on one of his servants. The second murder had been committed in the same manner, in a brothel. The body of a young prostitute had been found in the sewers. The third murder had been the result of a tavern brawl. Young Daljol had an argument with the innkeeper, with whom he accused of having insulted his dead father. In the middle of the conflict, Mitamiel had drawn a knife and stabbed the innkeeper in plain sight of the guests. Even though he'd been called to testify before the tribunal, the result was obvious. How easy it was to turn the world if a few witnesses' tongues can be plated with gold. Maybe the tribunal would sentence him sooner or later, after the demons in him had caused dozens more victims, but that's something the Libra is going to prevent. I stood up and moved noiselessly. Nobody noticed me while I sneaked through the kitchen and the atrium up the stairs, along the hallway decorated with old, fine harnesses, towards the chamber of the man I intended to kill. Because melting the lock here would have resulted in an unpleasant scent, I took a lockpick from my pocket, tricked the mechanism, and entered. Many times I asked myself what would have happened if I'd been more aware of my surroundings. Would I have noticed the detail that I painfully became aware of minutes later, with blood-soaked hands and a heart tired yet racing after the strange, revealing nectar? Maybe things would have taken a different course. Maybe not. The weak light of a moonless sky shone on the mournful scenery in front of me. A large, misplaced canopy bed with rumpled sheets stood in the front end of the room. Books that had fallen from the shelves lay on the floor, and a scimitar, presumably intended as a piece of decoration, had been jammed into an expensive-looking table, like in a tasteless still life. I wrinkled my nose and tried to imagine what the prostitute who had been killed by the young nobleman had felt. Had she sensed her fate as she entered the room in which every corner, the empty bottles of wine and the carelessly tossed clothes screamed negligence? Presumably she did. I imagined how she had tried to play down her uneasiness with a girlish giggle. I looked at the bed in which the demoniac slept. He panted clumsily, his legs spread and his hands sprawled out like a squire. There he had taken what he wanted from the girl. Had he already started to strangle her then? Had he still tried to stay calm? When had her feigned exclamations of lust become real, fearful ones? I bit my bottom lip and shook my head, trying to get rid of those unpleasant thoughts. I would know what had happened quickly enough, whether Dajjal wanted it or not, and I was going to enjoy it. I drew my dagger from its sheath. It slipped out almost noiselessly like a snake encroaching on its prey. I looked at my victim with a mixture of pity and contempt. Regardless of his 24 years, Mitamiel Dajjal had the tender features of a boy. A sparse beard grew on his chin, his cheeks were smooth, his naked chest was covered with red spots, and his shoulders were narrow and lanky. To a certain extent, he reminded me of my former self, except for the obtrusive smell of sweat and alcohol. The demons are inside you, I said subconsciously. I opened my leather bag and removed a black, thick cloth from it. Then I sat down next to him on the edge of the bed. In the shadows, I probably looked like a mother singing her child to sleep. I laughed briefly, to which Dajjal reacted with a protesting sigh, but he did not wake up. He rolled to the side, moved his knees to his chest, and crossed his arms like a child. I shook my head. If I had not known about the fragile man's deeds, I would have considered him a pitiable, spoiled noble's son. But he was not one of these. He had given himself to the demons, not just once, but several times, and others had to pay the price for his lack of willpower. Therefore, the Black Libra had sentenced him to death. I took a moment to ponder what the killing was going to feel like. Then I grabbed Dajjal's neck with my right hand, pressed his head against the pillow, and pushed a gag in his mouth with my left hand. The man opened his eyes at once. I tensed my muscles, expecting him to try to push me back. Yet nothing happened. I felt his almost scarily regular breath on my nose, as if he had expected to wake up with a gag in his mouth. His grey-blue eyes were wide, and he stared at me with horror. With horror, or with resignation to his fate? I had planned to stab him at once in the chest with my dagger I had placed on my lap, quickly without ado, yet there was something in his eyes that irritated me, and I was unable to name it. For a moment, we both remained in this strange position. Then Mitamil Dajjal, murderer of 3 innocent people, started to cry. What was first a shimmer in his reddened eyes soon filled the corners, and the tears beaded down his smooth cheeks. A choked sobbing was audible through the gag. I regarded him with irritation. I was used to demoniacs starting to cry or begging for mercy when they were facing their punishment, but it was fear which I normally saw in my victims' eyes, and their tears were a result of the instinct of self-preservation. His sobbing, his expression, his tears, however, there was something different about them. They seemed sad, devastated. What if he is innocent? It shot through my head. What if the Libra is wrong? Why, no. Even in the tavern at the farmer's coast, I had found 2 people who had been able to tell me about his deeds. To doubt the sentence of the Libra was betrayal. Betrayal of myself, of the Libra, of your destiny. I tightened my grip around his neck. Still no reaction beyond silent tears. He resigns. He knows that there is no rescue from his possession, and he surrenders to his fate. Time seemed to stand still. Everything happened with an otherworldly clarity, as if nothing existed except for me and the young man I was about to kill. I thought I could hear the movement of his teary eyes in their sockets. Do it. Fulfill your duty. With a cry which could have been an expression of anger as well as helplessness, I withdrew my hand from the gag, grabbed my dagger, and rammed it deep into my victim's chest. His eyes widened, glowing with relief, which inspired a wave of rage inside me. Regret. It flashed in my mind, full of anger. Regret your weakness. I removed the blade, raised it, and stabbed him again, this time a tiny bit underneath his larynx. I felt resistance and pushed harder. Now Mitamil Dajjal uttered a choked whine, but still he did not try to defend himself. Irritated, I extracted my dagger and stared at him. His head had sunk to the side, and the gag had fallen from his mouth. It seemed like he wanted to say something, but only a rattle left his mouth. Why? I uttered to him as well as to myself. Why don't you regret? He did not answer. Life was slipping from his body. I could feel it. His sins I remembered with a jolt. If I lose him now, I won't be able to see them. For the last time, I lifted my blade and drove it into his neck. A fountain of blood spurted against me, but while the warm liquid on my skin usually caused triumph, I did not feel anything now. Then the fire seized me, and I plunged into the black. Chapter 10. The Fall. For several heartbeats, I saw nothing. Then my view cleared, and I felt the fire fill my veins. With one eye, I saw reality. How I sat on the edge of the bed, the blood-stained dagger still stuck in the body of my victim, which was weakly twitching in the throes of death. That vision was blurred and limited, equal to that of a man peeking through a keyhole in another room. What I witnessed with the other eye was clearer, his thoughts, his memory. I saw a corridor which was covered with red carpets. It was the corridor I had just walked through to get to Mitamil's room. From his room I heard sobs. I took a step towards the door and heard a voice from nowhere. It was hard, cold, and without love. You are useless. I sensed that it belonged to Mitamil's father, who had died a short while ago. I went along. The sobs grew louder and mingled with screams. A jolt went through the spectral version of myself, and I was thrown into another memory before I could make it to the door to the bedroom. I saw him, 17 winters old, sitting at a large table laid out with all sorts of dishes. His head was lowered. On the other end of the table sat his father, whose face seemed familiar to me. A woman was sitting by his side, her eyes staring dreamily and impassively into the void, as if her mind was somewhere else. This world is no place for weaklings. Why don't you understand? I do, father. Mitamil's voice was monotonous. Apparently you don't, or you would not behave like a damn fishwife. The image turned black, and I was back in the hallway. The cries multiplied, echoed around me from different angles. I took a step towards the bedroom, one more, and another one. Then, a new memory. This time, I saw Mittermall standing by a door with his back turned to it. He appeared to be listening. A man and a woman were shouting at each other in the adjacent room, the man furious and the woman pleading. I recognized the male voice as belonging to Mittermall's father. Again and again, the dull sound of impact could be heard. I did not need to witness the scene in order to understand what was happening, and neither did Mittermall. His face was contorted in a grimace of disgust and anger. He despised him for what he did to his mother. He despised him for his deeds. I was back in the corridor. Having arrived at the door to Mittermall's room, the fire burned greedily and glaringly in me, but the intoxication it sent through my veins felt wrong. It was supposed to feel triumphant, but instead I felt guilty. Empty. No, I whispered. He had killed. He had allowed the demons to enter him, and this was going to be his rightful punishment. The door in Mittermall's memory swung open, and I entered. The room was similarly wrecked as the version in which my actual self was sitting beside his dying body. But now the chaos seemed more recent. The scattered sheets and books, and the overturned table, the silent witness of an outburst of fury, anger, or despair. Mittermall was crouching on his bed, beardless and clean, completely unlike the man in whose throat I had just driven a dagger. Tears dried on his cheeks, tears that I knew his father had despised him for, calling him a girl. Now his eyes were dry and reddened, and they stared into nothingness like his mother's had in the dining room. He was broken. Why am I seeing this? I understood nothing of what was happening around me. What I was supposed to see were his sins, the moments in which he had allowed the demons to enter. The moments he had been weak and had chosen sin and greed instead of fortitude and virtue. The moments that had made him the monster that he was. Determined, I walked towards him. Lightning struck with a crash, illuminating the image. Then it returned to normal, and nothing had changed. Almost nothing. I was still in Mittermall's room, and in his head, but neither had the shelves been knocked over, nor was he crouching on the bed. In his stead, a book lay open on the sheets. I leaned forward to read it. The ink on the first page was still fresh. 15th day of the Kraken, 8088. Father says there is no place in the world for weaklings, but he is wrong. It took me a long time to realize this, but I feel the truth in my words as I write them down. At first I hated him for his bad deeds, his shady dealings, his trips to the Undercity, the things he did to Mother, that without any doubt contributed to her death. Why he has only ever injured me verbally instead of beating me is beyond me. Maybe because I am after all his son? I don't know. What he is unable to understand, though, is the simple truth. He is the true weakling. Despite wealth, status, and the honor of his path, he is still little more than a desperate child inside, trying to use his power in order to gain acceptance and esteem. How easy it is to fall for this kind of pattern when we are not aware of it. I am ashamed at the thought of the things I've done. Little things they were, my mind tries to justify, but only now I realize how close I was to succumb to the very same cycle of violence and self-loathing as my father. Why did I beat up the noble boy? Back then I said to myself, because he had treated me disrespectfully. Today I know that I only wanted to prove to my father that I am actually a strong man, and I am certain that if I had not realized it, one thing would have led to another, and harmless bullying would have resulted in much worse behavior. I would quickly have become exactly what I feared. My mind is made up. I will change, and once I am the upright person I am striving to be, my father will realize the perfidy of his deeds. I have it in me, and he has it as well. I believe it from the bottom of my heart. Stunned, I stared at the open diary in front of me. He wanted to change. Was it really possible? Were his intentions so noble? But how, I wondered. He was obsessed. And once the demons had lived inside a human for too long, there was no turning back. A luring uneasiness rose inside me, and with horror, I realized its familiarity. It was the feeling of being misguided, which had made me leave Fogville, betray my path, and join the Black Libra, and now it was back again. I heard a heavy thud behind me, like a body falling to the ground. It was Mittermall de Jol. An older man, who I identified as a servant of the house, was standing in the doorway. Mittermall had fallen to the ground and buried his face in his hands. The fire raged wildly inside me, but its intoxicating effect felt out of place, like an intruder. "We came too late," I heard the servant say. He looked to the ground as if to avoid the gaze of his master, although Mitimal did not raise his head. "I am sorry." When he received no response, the old man turned around and left. A jolt shot through my body. The fire had fled. It had seen the sins. Mitimal Dajjal was dying. The spectral world around me began to fade, slowly but gradually, like the ink on a letter left in the rain. Irritated, I looked from the diary on the bed to the memory of the man whom I had judged, the man who had murdered 3 innocent people, the man who had given in to sin. He had despised his father's actions. He wanted to change himself and his father, yet he had become a murderer. Why? What was the message delivered by the servant? A weak light started to glow inside of me, a shimmer of understanding. Who knows how things would have turned out if I had simply closed my eyes in the last moment I had been in Mitimal's memory. But I watched. With a tortured slowness, my eyes wandered from the clean marble floor to the shelves filled with ancient knowledge, and stopped above the opulent doorframe, which I had crossed to enter the room. A round shield in a golden frame was attached to the wall, painted with a crest. It depicted a bear. My memories of the moments I woke up are as pale and blurry as those of my escape from Fogville. I clearly remembered, however, that I got up from the bed with slow, calm movements which an outside observer might have misunderstood as a sign of serenity, or, in light of the act I had just committed, of cold-bloodedness. Mitimal Dajjal was dead. I did not have to cast a look at him to know it. My heart pounded wildly in my chest, exhilarated by the nectar of his sins. Yet I felt cold. I do not recall my escape from the building any more. When I approached the city gate, I could still smell the smoke of the fire I had set. The gate was closed, but there was light in the guardhouse. I had no idea how to explain to the guards why I wanted to leave the city at such a late hour, but I did not have to. In case of necessity, if it were the only way to gain distance, I would simply reduce the gate and every guard to ash. Again, I felt the old paralyzing fear in my stomach. Only this time, there was no escaping it. I had been following a lie from beginning to end. There were no demons taking possession of people. There were no sins, no corruption. There was only cause and effect. I myself had sealed young Dajjal's fate by killing his father. He wanted to change. My eyes were burning. My limbs were hurting. My thoughts were not in harmony with the fire anymore. It sensed the dissonance and punished me for it. "Go back," I heard its voice speaking to me from the blaze. "Go back and do what you are meant to do." I ignored it. My fist was firmly clenched around my dagger while I walked toward the gatehouse. I saw the silhouette of a man flicker. The small building was separated from outsiders by bars. I swallowed, prepared myself for speaking, and halted. I knew the face that looked at me through the window, and I knew the smile lurking on the lips. The man leaned back in the chair, legs crossed and arms behind his head. "Where are you bound?" Kalian asked. He spoke like a man who had run into a good friend after a long night in the taverns. I did not need the fire to realize what was going on inside my mentor's head. He can feel it. I remained silent, unable to respond. The situation reminded me of my old self, secluded with a heavy tongue and no life experience. Kalian decided to remain silent as well, so we were left only observing one another for a while. His body seemed to cast no shadow despite the bright candlelight in front of him, but maybe it was only a figment of my imagination. Finally, he broke the silence. "I will not stop you, but they will come to get you." I said nothing. "We have all been where you are now." I was filled with a dull rage. "Have you?" "Yes, my friend." He let his gaze wander, as in many of our conversations before. "We have. It is our fault, Kalian. It is not the fault of demons or sins. It is only our fault." A word formed on my tongue. First there was a tickle. Then there was a clear shape, and before I knew, I had spoken it. It is a cycle. Kalian smiled like a master smiled at his student when he came to understandable but naive conclusion. Then he shook his head. "I will not stop you," he repeated. "One day you will make a decision, and I hope it will be the right one." My hands were shaking, and my fear was overwhelming. I felt tears prick behind my eyes. It was all in vain. I'd believed to be special, to make the world better with my deeds, to find my destiny, but I had not found anything. I had joined a group of lunatics who made themselves judge over life and death, with wild magic and unholy rituals. Open the gate. My voice was merely a whisper. Kalian nodded with a pinch of regret. He had expected my answer. 3 draws of breath later, the machinery started to move, and the gate rattled upward. I warped through it again without looking at Kalian. No one leaves the Black Libra. I heard his voice behind me. It was neither angry nor malicious, only sad. No one. I disappeared into the dark of night. My hand hurts. I sense that they are coming closer. I want to end it myself. I would like to claim that my reasons are admirable, or at least sympathetic in a way, like guilt or a sense of honor that would be a lie. Pure fear is driving me. Fear of what the Black Libra does to traitors. The place where I started writing this transcript will be the place where I leave this world. Was it fate that my life was going to end here? The fact that I am hiding in an old abandoned trading post in the middle of a forest makes this conclusion likely. I was not aware of the irony of my fate before I woke up between these cold stone walls yesterday morning. I had wandered all night, and I remember the strange figure walking 30 arms lengths in front of me at all times. I had followed. Shortly before I had found the clearing, she turned toward me a last time and smiled at me. The adornment in her hair had sounded like wind chimes from Calais. Then she had disappeared, like she had never been there in the first place. I wish I had more meaningful words to end this transcript, but I don't. As I have mentioned before, it is meant to be an account, nothing more. An account of what made J.L. Tennyson, the nameless one, the Butcher of Ark. I am so tired that my eyes are filled with tears, and my hands are shaking in anticipation of what I am about to do. Several dozen people died by my blade, yet I am too cowardly when it comes to taking my own life. I have a final plea to you. My story will not only be twisted by heralds and the Order, but also by the Black Libra. It was born in the shadows, and there it will remain. Nowhere will you find traces of its deeds, and with artfulness and treachery it will cover the traces I am leaving behind. Besides simple explanation, I was straying from my path. I was a monster. There will be other assertions which will satisfy scholars and philosophers. Do not listen to them. They are nothing but lies. Epilogue. Letter of the Chronicler. Dear Turris, I had chuckled upon reading your latest letter. No, the Black Libra does not exist. And yes, I do consider your research on its machinations a waste of time. Why, you ask me? It is very simple. J.L. Tennyson was stark raving mad, up to the last sensible corner of his brain. He suffered from horrid delusions, and nearly everything you have read in the previous pages is nonsense. Now, I am well aware that his claim fits the book's closing statement only too well, but allow me to shed light on the life and deeds of the Butcher of Ark, and what truly happened, and you will see how what I say is infinitely more sensible than Tennyson's metaphysical ramblings on demons, the Black Libra, and the fire. J.L. Tennyson was born to a common carpenter and his companion in the year 8056, in a small village called Northwind. Therefore, his true age at the beginning of the chronicle was 32 instead of 28. This also increases the age at which he was abandoned from 2 to 4. Being of frail stature and small body size, his age seemed to have been simply been underestimated. His natural father went by the name of Samuel Chipblade, and was utterly violent and mentally challenged man. Both of these streaks, it pains me to say, have been attributed to his deeply rooted religiosity. Obsessively punctual, he visited the local temple several times per day to pray, never missed even a single mass or sermon, and was able to recite all of the path to 101 verses in their full length. Nothing was more important to him than to abide by the path and to love our Lord Malthus, and these were his exact expectations of his fellow villagers too, which, as you might be able to guess, led to him living a very isolated life. Though he usually followed the priest's sermons, he often thought their contents too shallow, and Northwind's handling of pathlessness too lenient. When he did not pray, he worked, denying himself desires such as lovemaking, alcohol, and even music, and so the village was surprised when rumors that Samuel would become a father began to circulate. Though he denied it, everyone knew who the mother was, a young wandering prostitute often seen at his house over the past weeks. The public knowledge of the pregnancy put Samuel in a difficult situation. Abandoning a pregnant woman and thus committing murder on babe and woman both was a grave sin, even if the woman concerned was of low status or a prostitute. But more importantly, it did not in the least fit his self-perception, so he picked the only option available to him. He married the woman, not older than 20 winters at the time, and 5 months later, the young JL was born. As one might imagine, he was not born under a lucky star. Though Samuel had always been inclined towards aggressive and quick-tempered behavior, according to the priest I interrogated, this aggression only increased with parenthood. The fear and horror recognizable in Chipblade's young companion had been almost palpable during the 3-day mass he confessed. So things took their course, and, as if he had not already done so, Samuel increasingly sealed himself and his family off from the outside world. But now you will have guessed what happened, dear Taurus, so I will keep things short. Samuel Chipblade abused both his companion and his young son. What began with scolding looks and curses slowly turned to regular beatings with a birch. This he, of course, merely did to protect his loved ones, as he confessed to the priest once. Both his companions and his boy were befallen by demons, horrible demons whose only purpose was to drive them from the right path, to taint them. One cannot purge them forever, he said to the priest, his voice shaking, because they always return, no matter what you do, no matter how devoted the prayers or how chaste one's thoughts, they always return. Why the priest didn't intervene? He did not fully suspect how bad things truly were. Corporal punishment for children and women is not unheard of, especially not among the rural populace, and the truth only dawned on him when one morning he watched the young woman go to the village's well. A gust of wind freed her from her veil and revealed an abundance of cuts, bumps, and broken bones. Do you remember the butcher's crow-like nose? It is a remnant of such an exorcism. There is little more to say of this sad period of his life, except for its tragic end in an act of despair. JL's mother took her own life, but only after she had crushed her husband's skull with a heavy hammer. The starving boy was found 5 days later in his parents' bedchamber. The empty eyes focused on the bloody shrine of Malthus. To this day, I do not know whether he had been present during the horrible deed, or whether he had entered the room when both his parents were already dead. He did not cry, spoke no word, and his eyes were nothing like those of a 4-year-old anymore. When I asked why the boy had not been given to a family from the village, the priest confessed with lowered eyes that no one was willing to take him in. A child who had already seen murder and violence at such a young age would undoubtedly bring misfortune on those near it, people said. And besides, time were hard and wheat scarce. In the end, JL was wrapped in a wooden blanket, and the priest travelled with him to the fog road and deposited him before a shrine, in the hopes that someone would take pity on the young boy. You already know of Gilman, the tanner who would later raise him. He shared neither Samuel Chipblade's religious fervour nor his brutality, but as you certainly concluded from the butcher's writings, he provided everything for the boy except an environment in which his sacred soul could heal. As he turned 11 winters old, he began an apprenticeship with the local priest and came to oversee the temple of Fogville 5 years later. The villagers saw him as a silent, dutiful man with a constantly uneasy expression. It did indeed take 3 days before his disappearance following the Star Summon's Night feast was noted. In the 3rd chapter of his account, JL finally tells us of the events that transpired in the Red Ox, a small tavern not far from Ark where an essentially harmless act of revenge escalated into his first killing. In incredible detail, he recounts the inebriating feeling which took hold of him during the murder, then turning his attention to his first encounter with Kalian, who accompanied him as a mentor and friend during the following moons and winters. Here, however, fact and fiction, truth and fantasy begin to mix for the first time. The innkeeper of the Red Ox might still remember a sad-looking thin man being humiliated, who then, together with the 2 riders, had disappeared early in the following morning. A man such as Kalian, however, had never been seen at the tavern. Now, while the inconsistency might be attributed to the countless faces the innkeeper must have encountered since, the fact that both giants, Naratil and Jorah Dalcaric, who are indeed quite nasty fellows, have been seen in Ark a few days later, both in perfect health, makes opposition pointless. No, you have not misread, Taurus. Both men who, according to the butcher, died a bloody death that night are in fact well and alive, and I have actually spoken to them during my inquiries. I don't know what truly happened at the Red Ox, but I strongly suspect that on that evening, JL's inner need to take revenge for his humiliation caused his insanity to take root for the first time. He felt weak, and the violence he was subjected to subconsciously reminded him of the situations his father used to put him in. But at the same time, he was obviously lacking the power to do something against this, and at this point his imagination gained the upper hand, and he conjured up a variant of the events which was simply never true. He subsequently fled into the forest. Now you may say that my claim that the murders were a mere product of imagination is nothing more than conjecture, but let me first continue with my account and explain my underlying thesis later. About 6 moons before the murders with a proven connection to J.L. Tennyson began, he claims to have arrived in Ark. He posits to have found refuge in a tavern together with his mentor and his companions, only to wipe out a sort of child brothel in the Undercity the following day, together with Kalian. Again, the innkeeper of the Dancing Nomad recognized JL on a drawing, but was unable to remember a person fitting the description of Kalian. Even the brothel I mentioned has never existed in the form described, as my contacts in the Undercity have assured me. But is secrecy and covertness not the entire point of such an institution? You might ask me now. Yes, dear tourists, it is. But such an establishment could only exist under the protection of a large organization, such as the Relata, and under these circumstances you can be assured that the destruction of such a, it pains me to say, profitable source of income would not have been tolerated by the Relata. No, both of us know that what the organization is capable of, and what they do to those acting against their authority. What actually happened was that more and more homeless and sick were found murdered in the Undercity's alleys, all of them barely recognizable from myriads of stabbing wounds. Tannyson's thumbprint. The first instance of both JL's narrative and the truth aligning occurred 3 months later and coincides with the passing of the so-called trial. Back then, the first corpses had been discovered, and here we begin to speak of the Butcher of Ark, due to the brutality of the victims' deaths. The following year, during which JL wreaked havoc in Ark, managed to escape first the guard and later the Holy Order itself, due to his perfidious intelligence, a total of 24 murders were committed, where the Butcher's involvement is beyond doubt, and another dozen where it cannot be ruled out. A second person was never involved, and not all of his victims had been guilty of crimes. You probably ask yourself the same question as in the beginning of this letter. Why the deviations? Why invent a mysterious secret society with the aim to keep evil in check? Why the talk of a nectar of sin, enabling the murderer to enter the memories of his victims to be rewarded with sexual ecstasy? I, for my part, have found a solution to this riddle, and it rests on my conviction that very few of this world's murderers and criminals view themselves as evil, instead believing to do the right thing. We are so good at creating models of thought that help us in reconciling our deeds with our self-perception. This was no different with J.L. Tennyson, and the essence of what caused him to commit his crimes is firmly rooted in his childhood. You can surely imagine that his childhood had profound effects on J.L. Tennyson. I am certain that on a subconscious level, J.L. knew what his father did unto him, and that he hated him with a passion. You also know that children cannot yet distinguish between themselves and their environment, especially in early years. I suspect that this was the case with J.L. too. The more he hated his father, the more he hated himself, blamed himself for the pain endured by his mother and him. His father has said it, hadn't he? I only want to protect you. It's the demons, always the demons. You always allow them into your hearts. Again and again, the boy failed in this, and again, he and his mother had to pay dearly for it. How he wished for peace, his father's love, for harmony, but he would never receive it, for when the demons possessed his mother one last time, they robbed him of the only 2 people he had ever known. Unable to even try to process his experiences, the horrible images, the raw hate, the guilt, and the biting accusation, a deeply rooted realization were confined in a mental casket that his child's mind buried deep in his subconscious, so he would feel nothing but diffuse, omnipresent fear that kept him from ever experiencing something akin to true happiness. Until the day of his trauma, when he was confronted with his repressed memories for the first time, by seeing his own corpse. I am sure that finding his own rotting corpse represented the part of him which had been repressed and locked away, slumbering all these years. Now, however, its burdening presence had grown too strong to ignore any longer. He would die if he did not learn to understand, calm, or heal it, and so he fled head over heels from his life, his only compass being an impalpable feeling which would lead to his death, much like the flame to the moth. It punished him with an insufferable fear when he acted against it, and it rewarded him with maniacal ecstasy when he did something right. Without that feeling, he would have never left his village, never begun to kill for his imaginary construct of the Black Libra. Indeed, without it, he would never have become the Butcher of Ark, instead ending his peaceful, if a bit sad existence as a priest of Progville. He dubbed his feeling fire. I call it searching for forgiveness. With every decision, with every murder, every step he took, he wanted only one thing: to triumph where he had failed before, to finally achieve the peace he had always hoped for. He wanted to cleanse the world of the demons that had caused so much suffering for his family. His father had, after all, only wanted to protect his family from them. Can you follow? The demons, the fire, the Black Libra, it was all nothing more than his subconscious desire for absolution. Absolution for a crime he never committed. The demons JL saw in his victims were nothing more than projections of the guilt he felt for the deaths of his parents, and by murdering, he tried to atone for it. Maybe my thesis seems absurd to you at first glance, but think of all the parallels between JL's account and his past. The most obvious would likely be his choice of words: sinner, demon, and soul cleanser. Humanity is weak and rotten, but there is a hidden order protecting it from its downfall. What could this be if not a reconstruction of his familial background? It continues with the imaginary person of Kalian. Is he not an idealized incarnation of what JL would have wanted to be? Strong, lawless, full of desire to live, and absolutely devoted to the Black Libra. Without the doubt, JL had until the end, and that would ultimately be the cause of the final parallel to his childhood, his failure. Though dozens had to give their life because of Tannisson's mad quest for forgiveness, it ended with the same cognition as for the small boy in the past. But no matter the self-sacrifice, in the end, he had been too weak. His will, his scrupulousness, his belief in the righteousness of his cause, it was to no avail. He had failed, and left this world as a broken man. You see, dear tourists, the parallels are too obvious to be merely accidental. I have been unable to decipher merely two symbols in his story: the veiled woman appearing in his vision, and the admission ritual. I do have my theories, but they are vague still. You can calmly lean backwards, however. The day a wild mage enters your room to kill you and then digest your sins, I am sure they are countless. I will not arrive, the Black Libra does not exist, and neither does the fire, or Kalian. To me, the story of the Butcher of Ark is primarily the sad testimony of a man who took countless innocent lives on his quest for forgiveness. Who in the end is to blame? He? His father? And if you choose the latter, how can you know whether Samuel Chipblade, with his sick religiosity and his purges, too, had been merely trying to heal a scar on his soul? A scar he also had no fault in creating? Here J.L. Tannisson was right. It is an eternal chain of cause and effect. A cycle. And nowhere in it will you find someone to blame. Carolil Dalgama, Arcanist of the Third Sigil and Chronicler of the Holy Order. The end. What an incredibly long story. It was a very good story. Very well written, I have to say. But goodness gracious, why is it so long? they could have cut down on that. But yeah, I have no idea how long this video is going to be. I estimated originally that it was going to be like just about 3 hours, but I think it's closer to 4 or maybe even 5. I have no idea. It was like half an hour per book. It was ridiculous. But anyway, we have finished the story. I'm now going to have to figure out how to write a synopsis of that story so that I can explain it in the video for people who obviously don't want to read, don't want to listen to this video, which I completely understand. If you made it to this point in the video, though, round of applause. This has taken me 3 sessions to record because my mouth keeps getting really dry from all the reading and everything. So, yeah. I don't even know what to say. It's a very good story, but why did they make it so long? Also, I also wanted to mention that these books, they're not the same color. Like, some of them are blue, and then some of them are like a teal color. And I mean, that one's like more green as well. Like, why did they not make them all the same shade of blue? And it's not like it even like goes up in a gradient or anything. They're just not the same, and that is really upsetting to me. But anyway, yeah, very good story. A little bit dark. Well, quite dark actually. It's the story of a freaking serial killer. Of course, it's dark. Yeah. I also I think this is a book that I need to read to get an achievement. So yeah, I won't be reading this out loud because I mean, Jesus, these are also all loud. But maybe just reading that book will get me an achievement. Who knows? Anyway, this video is long enough, so I hope you've enjoyed the story. And yeah, if you got to this point, congrats. Go and get yourself a pastry or something as a reward. I'm gonna drink a whole jug of water. But for now, I hope you've enjoyed story time. And yeah, like the video, I don't know, whatever. I'll see you in the next episode.